I had just brought my 3-day-old son home from the hospital, my body still aching from a brutal C-section, only to find the smart lock on my front door flashing red. My husband had changed the passcode and hopped on a flight for a luxury vacation with his family because my postpartum recovery was going to ruin their vibe. So instead of begging them to let me into my own home, I quietly sold the entire property with all their designer belongings still inside. When they returned with their golden tans, they had no house, no belongings, and no idea that their cruelty had just made them homeless. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind toxic people exactly who holds the keys to your life. The wind whipping through our upscale Atlanta suburb was unseasonably bitter that Tuesday afternoon. I was 32 years old, standing on the pristine front porch of the house I had painstakingly decorated, shivering in a thin maternity cardigan. In my arms, wrapped in 2 layers of fleece hospital blankets, was Malik, my newborn son. He was barely 72 hours old. My entire world had shifted the moment the nurses placed his tiny, fragile body against my chest. But right now, all I wanted was to step inside the warmth of my own foyer, lay my baby in his expensive crib, and finally rest. My physical state was an absolute nightmare. The emergency surgery had left me with a deep, searing incision across my lower abdomen. The hospital staff had pumped me full of painkillers, but the hour-long ride home had worn them off completely. Every breath I took felt like a jagged knife dragging across my stomach. Over my left shoulder, a massive diaper bag weighed down on me, the heavy canvas strap digging painfully into my collarbone. In my right hand, I held the heavy infant car seat carrier, trying my hardest not to jostle Malik, who was beginning to stir and whimper from the biting cold. I shuffled toward the heavy mahogany front door, my legs feeling like lead. I reached out a trembling finger to our smart lock keypad. I knew the code by heart. It was the anniversary of the day Marcus and I met. I punched in the 6 digits, anticipating the familiar green glow and the soft mechanical click of the deadbolt sliding open. Instead, the keypad let out a sharp, angry beep. The LED ring flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. I blinked, my exhausted brain struggling to process the rejection. I must have miskeyed it. My fingers were practically frozen, and the heavy burden of the car seat was throwing off my balance. I readjusted my grip, shifting Malik slightly so I could use my thumb to press each number with deliberate precision. 1, 4, 0, 9, 1, 8, beep, beep, red light. A cold knot of confusion formed in the pit of my stomach, completely separate from the surgical pain radiating from my waist. The smart lock was practically brand new. Marcus, my husband of 4 years, had insisted on installing it just a month prior. He loved to project the image of a successful, tech-savvy financial broker, outfitting our home with the latest gadgets to impress his friends and his demanding family. I had agreed because it meant I would not have to fumble for keys when carrying groceries, or in this case, a newborn baby. I tried the code a 3rd time, pressing the numbers so hard my fingernail ached. Beep beep, red light. The sheer absurdity of the situation began to settle over me. I was locked out of my own home. I looked around the quiet, manicured cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was practically deserted at this time of day. The sprawling lawns and imposing brick facades offered no comfort, just empty windows staring back at me. A sharp gust of wind swept across the porch, cutting right through my thin sweater and chilling me to the bone. Malik let out a thin, wavering cry, his tiny face turning red as the cold air nipped at his cheeks. "Hush, baby, mama is right here," I whispered, my voice trembling. I shifted the heavy carrier again, trying to shield him from the wind with my own body. The movement sent a blinding shockwave of agony through my abdomen. I gasped, dropping my forehead against the heavy wooden door, squeezing my eyes shut, as a wave of nausea washed over me. I felt a sudden, terrifying warmth spreading across my lower stomach, soaking into the thick bandages hidden beneath my loose sweatpants. My incision was bleeding. The doctor had given me strict instructions before I left the hospital. No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity, and absolutely no standing for prolonged periods. I had already broken all 3 rules just trying to get from the driveway to the porch. Now the physical strain of holding the heavy car seat and the massive diaper bag combined with the freezing temperatures was pushing my freshly sutured body past its breaking point. The panic that had been simmering in the background suddenly boiled over into full-blown terror. I was bleeding. My newborn was freezing and crying, and the front door of my own house was rejecting me. I frantically pounded my free hand against the solid wood, the dull thuds echoing pointlessly in the empty driveway. "Marcus!" I yelled, my voice cracking from exhaustion and cold. Marcus opened the door. "The code is not working." Silence. There was no sound from inside, no familiar footsteps hurrying down the hardwood hallway, no annoyed sigh from my husband complaining about the noise. Just the relentless howl of the Atlanta wind and the increasingly desperate cries of my 3-day-old son. My mind raced through a dozen different scenarios. Had the battery in the lock died? No, the keypad was lighting up perfectly fine. Had there been a power surge that reset the system? That did not make sense either. The lock was specifically designed to retain its programming during power failures. There was only one logical explanation, but it was so unfathomably cruel that my sleep-deprived brain refused to accept it. Someone had intentionally gone into the mobile app and changed the master passcode. I leaned heavily against the doorframe, my legs shaking so violently I thought I might collapse right there on the welcome mat. The blood was definitely seeping through my bandages now, the warm, sticky sensation spreading uncomfortably against my skin. Every second that passed drained another ounce of my strength. I looked down at Malik. His cries were becoming frantic, his little fists clenched tight inside his swaddle. He was hungry, cold, and exhausted, just like his mother. I needed to sit down. I needed to feed him. I needed to check my stitches before I hemorrhaged on my own front porch. I carefully lowered the car seat onto the cold concrete, biting my lip to keep from screaming as my abdominal muscles protested the bending motion. I let the heavy diaper bag slide off my shoulder, the relief instantly overshadowed by the throbbing pain in my midsection. Breathing heavily, I leaned back against the brick wall of the house and pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers were so numb I could barely unlock the screen. I needed to call Marcus. I needed to tell him the lock was malfunctioning. Surely he was just inside wearing his noise-canceling headphones, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife and newborn son were freezing on the doorstep. But as the screen illuminated my face, a profound sense of wrongness washed over me. The driveway was empty. Marcus had driven me to the hospital 3 days ago in his luxury SUV. He had stayed for the delivery, taken a dozen perfectly curated photos for his social media, and then announced he needed to go home to rest because the hospital chair was hurting his back. He promised he would be back to pick us up this morning, but when the discharge papers were signed, he was nowhere to be found. I had called him 5 times from the hospital lobby, finally giving up, and ordering an expensive private car service to bring Malik and me home safely. I had convinced myself he must have fallen asleep, exhausted from the stress of becoming a father. I had made every excuse in the book for him, just like I had been doing for the past 4 years of our marriage. But standing there bleeding and shivering on the welcome mat, the excuses completely evaporated. I stared at the red light on the keypad. It was not a malfunction. It was a message, a deliberate, calculated barrier placed between me and my sanctuary. The agonizing pain in my stomach was nothing compared to the sharp, icy realization taking root in my chest. I was completely alone. My finger hovered over the dial pad on my phone, my vision blurring with unshed tears. The physical trauma of childbirth, the freezing wind and the terrifying sight of fresh blood staining my clothes were pushing me toward the edge of a complete breakdown. But beneath the panic and the pain, a tiny, resilient spark of fury began to ignite. I wiped my eyes, gritted my teeth against the searing pain in my abdomen, and opened my messages. I was not going to pass out on this porch. I was going to find out exactly what was going on. There were 3 new messages from Marcus. I tapped the screen, my thumb leaving a faint smear of blood on the glass from where I had been pressing against my incision. The first message was a photograph. It showed Marcus holding a crystal glass of champagne, grinning broadly with his perfectly capped teeth. Behind him sat his mother Beatrice, his sister Chloe, and Chloe's husband Chad. They were lounging in plush cream-colored leather chairs, surrounded by plates of artisanal cheeses and expensive pastries. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them, I could clearly see the unmistakable tail fin of a commercial airliner. They were in the airport VIP lounge. The second message was a text block. Boarding for the Bahamas in 20 minutes. The family needed a getaway, and honestly, your whole postpartum vibe is just too heavy right now. I need to de-stress. I changed the house code for security while I am gone. The third message was the final nail in the coffin of our 4-year marriage. Go stay with your cousin or something. Do not be dramatic about this. See you in 2 weeks. I stared at the glowing words. The freezing wind whipping across the porch seemed to vanish. The agonizing sharp throbbing in my abdomen faded into a dull, distant hum. All I could feel was an icy, absolute stillness spreading through my veins. The world seemed to push in tight around me, blurring out the manicured lawns and the imposing brick houses of our affluent neighborhood, narrowing my entire universe down to the callousness radiating from that screen. My vision sharpened. The tears I had been desperately holding back instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that settled deep in my bones. I hit the dial button. It rang 3 times. I fully expected it to go straight to voicemail, assuming he had already put his phone on airplane mode to avoid the consequences of his actions. But then the line clicked open. "Nia, I told you I am about to board," Marcus answered. His voice was laced with profound annoyance, completely devoid of any guilt or concern. In the background, I could hear the muffled, soothing voice of an airport PA system announcing a first-class boarding call. I could hear the clinking of glasses and the low, relaxed murmur of people who did not have a single care in the world. "Marcus," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the fresh blood soaking through my heavy sweatpants. "I am standing on the front porch. I am bleeding from my C-section. Malik is freezing in his car seat. Open the door right now." A heavy, exaggerated sigh echoed through the speaker. "You are being completely irrational and overly sensitive right now." Honestly, Nia, this right here is exactly why I had to leave. The postpartum hormones are making you crazy and you are suffocating me. I have been working under intense pressure for 9 months dealing with your pregnancy, and I need a break to de-stress. The house is locked. I am not risking a break-in while I am out of the country. You locked your 3-day-old son out in the freezing cold, I stated, presenting the fact plainly, waiting to see if a shred of paternal instinct existed inside the man I married. "Stop being so dramatic," Marcus snapped, his tone turning vicious. "Just order a car and go to your cousin's apartment across town. It is not a big deal. You always blow things out of proportion to make me look like the bad guy." Before I could respond to his staggering lack of empathy, there was a scuffling sound on the line. The phone had been snatched away. "Listen up, Nia," a new voice drawled. It was Chad, my white brother-in-law. He always spoke to me with a suffocating air of unearned superiority, treating me like a charity case who had somehow lucked into their prestigious family circle. "You need to stop ruining the vibe. Marcus promised to fund this luxury trip for us months ago, and you are totally killing the mood with your constant complaining. Chad." I warned, my grip on the phone tightening until my knuckles turned white, my fingernails digging painfully into my palm. "Put my husband back on the phone." "Husband. Just call an Uber and go to some relative's house." Chad continued, completely ignoring my warning, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "Marcus works hard. He deserves to treat his real family to a nice vacation without you dragging him down with your medical drama. Just deal with it yourself and let the man breathe for once." I could hear Marcus laughing in the background. My own husband was laughing while his freeloading brother-in-law berated me while I stood bleeding on a concrete porch clutching a newborn baby who was turning blue from the cold. Then the phone was violently yanked away again. This time the sharp, authoritative voice of my mother-in-law Beatrice pierced my ear. "Listen to me very carefully, little girl." Beatrice spat, her tone practically vibrating with absolute disdain. You are going to stop harassing my son this instant. You sit at home all day playing on your laptop with your little online side hustle while my son works 60 hours a week at a real firm. He bought that house. He pays the bills. He puts the food on your table. Beatrice. I started, but she cut me off, her volume rising to ensure everyone in the VIP lounge could hear exactly how she was putting her daughter-in-law in her proper place. No, you listen to me. If Marcus wants to lock his property to keep it secure while he treats his family to a well-deserved vacation, he has every legal right to do so. You contribute absolutely nothing of value to this marriage. So you are going to be quiet, know your place, and go recover somewhere else. Do not, you dare call this number again and ruin our trip. Click, the line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. The dial tone buzzed in the freezing air, a mechanical flatline that perfectly matched the sudden death of my marriage. I looked down at Malik. He had finally fallen asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling beneath the layers of fleece, blissfully unaware that his father's family had just discarded him like trash. I leaned my head back against the solid mahogany door. Beatrice's venomous words echoed in my mind, bouncing around the empty spaces of my exhaustion. He bought that house. He pays the bills. Your little online side hustle. A dark, humorless laugh escaped my lips, turning into a cloud of white vapor in the biting cold air. They were so arrogant, so deeply, profoundly stupid. Only, Marcus had always loved playing the role of the big, successful provider. He demanded we keep our finances completely separate so he could manage the big adult bills while I supposedly used my meager earnings for groceries and baby clothes. I had let him play that game because it kept the peace, and because I frankly did not care about his fragile ego. I let him believe his mid-level broker salary was keeping us afloat. I let Beatrice boast to her country club friends about her wealthy son providing a dream life for his wife. But there was a massive glaring flaw in their reality, a secret I had kept quietly guarded for the past 5 years, never feeling the need to brag or flaunt my actual wealth. My little online side hustle that Beatrice loved to mock was actually a rapidly expanding digital marketing agency. While Marcus was busy trying to impress his coworkers with expensive lunches and leased luxury cars he could barely afford, I was securing massive multi-million-dollar contracts with Fortune 500 companies right from my home office. Marcus did not buy this house. He did not even qualify for the mortgage. 2 years ago, when his credit check came back disastrously low due to his hidden credit card debts, I had quietly paid for the entire property in cash through a corporate LLC that I solely owned. I let him tell his family he bought it. I let him act like the king of the castle. But my name, and only my name, was on the deed. And as for the luxury Bahamas trip he was supposedly funding for Chad, Chloe, and Beatrice, I had seen the bank statements he carelessly left open on his iPad last week. He had maxed out 3 different joint credit cards that I had strictly opened for household emergencies to pay for their first-class tickets and 5-star resort villas. They thought they had just locked a helpless, dependent woman out of her only sanctuary. They thought they had secured all their precious designer belongings inside an impenetrable fortress while they flew off to sip margaritas on my dime. They had absolutely no idea that the house they just locked me out of was legally mine. They had no idea that their cruel dismissal had just flipped a switch inside me that could never be unfought. I slowly pushed myself off the doorframe, carefully ignoring the terrifying tearing sensation in my abdomen. I picked up the heavy infant carrier, gritting my teeth against the blinding flash of pain that shot up my spine. I did not call an Uber. I did not call my cousin. I walked painfully to the end of the long driveway, each step a testament to my newly forged resolve, and hailed a passing taxi that was dropping off a neighbor. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked, looking with deep concern at my pale face, the massive diaper bag, and the blood slowly staining my gray sweatpants. "To the best real estate attorney in Atlanta," I said, my voice steady, my eyes fixed firmly on the sprawling brick house I was leaving behind. "And then to a luxury hotel." I settled back into the leather seat as the taxi pulled away from the curb. The heater blasted warm air over Malik, and he let out a soft, contented sigh. My phone buzzed in my pocket with one final text from Marcus. It was an automated message he must have set up from his airline app. Flight 482 to Nassau has successfully departed. Have a great trip, Marcus, I thought. A cold, predatory smile finally reaching my eyes as I watched our neighborhood fade into the distance. I hope you enjoy the sunshine and the luxury while it lasts. Because when you come back, your entire world is going to be completely, irreversibly gone. The taxi glided smoothly onto the ramp of the downtown luxury hotel. I didn't reach for my wallet. Instead, I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen, the blue light reflecting in the dark interior of the car. My thumb hovered over the Apex Properties icon. I didn't need to cry anymore. The tears were a luxury I had already spent. I opened the app and the interface glowed cool and detached. A list of monthly transactions filled the screen. Every month, like clockwork, there it was $3,500 deposited from Marcus's personal account into the Apex Properties LLC corporate account. The reference line for every single transfer read, mortgage payment, house. I looked at the transaction history, tracing the numbers back 3 years to the day we signed the closing papers. My thumb tapped the Details tab, pulling up the original purchase agreement. The PDF opened, showing the property deed. It was dated a week before our wedding. The buyer was Apex Properties, LLC. The registered agent for that LLC, me. Marcus had spent the last 3 years chest-thumping about how hard he worked to provide a roof over our heads. He had bragged to Beatrice about how he'd secured this investment for our future. He had used the house as a status symbol, a physical manifestation of his success as a financial broker. Every time he sat at the dinner table and complained about how much he was sacrificing to pay the mortgage, I had sat there spooning peas onto Malik's plate, nodding along. I let him keep his little fantasy. I let him think he was the man of the house. In reality, he had been nothing more than a tenant. A tenant who was late on his rent, more often than not a tenant who constantly tried to renegotiate the terms, and now a tenant who had just locked his own landlady out of her property. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "We're here, ma'am. Do you need a hand with the bags?" "I've got it, thank you," I said, my voice crisp. I paid the driver with a digital transaction, then stepped out into the cool evening air. The hotel lobby was a sanctuary of polished marble and hushed, respectful silence. I checked in under my corporate account, feeling the weight of the last 3 days slowly begin to lift. Once inside the suite, I laid Malik in his bassinet, his small breathing rhythmic and steady. He was warm now. He was safe. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city skyline, my reflection ghostly against the dark glass. I pulled up the Apex Properties app again. There was a notification waiting. Marcus had attempted to log into the property management portal. He was clearly looking for a way to override the smart lock, trying to find a digital backdoor or a factory reset command. He was sweating in his seat somewhere over the Atlantic, frantic because his investment wasn't responding to his master passcode. I tapped the screen, pulling up the eviction protocol. It was a standard legal form, one that I had drafted with my attorney months ago, just in case things with Marcus ever went south, though I'd never imagined he would be stupid enough to try something like this. The automated system required nothing more than a digital signature to trigger a lockout notice to the local sheriff. I didn't press confirm just yet. That was too quick, too mercy-filled. I wanted to see the look on their faces when they landed. I wanted to see the moment the reality of their homelessness hit them. I opened the messaging app. The group chat I shared with Beatrice, Chloe, and Chad was still active. I typed a single message, keeping it short and incredibly sweet. "Just a heads up, the house was never yours to lock. I hope your vacation is as memorable as your future." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't want to hear Beatrice's screeching voice or Chad's pathetic attempts at dominance. I muted the chat, silencing their frantic notifications. I looked down at Malik, who was finally in a deep, peaceful sleep. The fear of bleeding out on the porch had left me, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a woman who was no longer playing the part of the fragile, dependent wife. My online side hustle wasn't just an agency, it was a global infrastructure. I had been quietly buying up commercial properties throughout the Southeast for years, using the steady, massive cash flow from my firm. Marcus thought I was making a few extra bucks to pay for groceries. He had no idea I was his landlord, his primary investor, and now the person who held the power to destroy his entire carefully curated life. I sat down at the small desk in the hotel suite, opened my laptop, and pulled up the financial reports for the firm. I had a board meeting in 3 hours. Marcus didn't know I was the silent partner in his own brokerage firm, a position I'd bought into using the dividends from my tech consulting work 2 years ago. He thought he was reporting to a nameless, faceless corporate board. Tonight I would be leading that meeting. Tonight Marcus would be sitting on a beach in the Bahamas, trying to figure out why his house key was dead, while I sat in a conference room in Atlanta, deciding whether or not to terminate his employment. The postpartum vibe he was so worried about ruining, he had no idea. He hadn't just ruined a vibe, he had just handed me the keys to his professional and personal annihilation. I picked up the phone again. I didn't call a cousin. I didn't call a friend. I dialed my lawyer's direct line. Attorney Vance. The voice on the other end was clipped and professional. This is Nia, I said, my voice hard and cold. The situation has escalated. I am ready to initiate the full dissolution of the marriage, the immediate eviction of all occupants from my primary residence, and I want you to prepare a corporate restructuring plan for the brokerage firm. I want Marcus off the board effective immediately. It's going to be a messy fight, Nia, Vance warned. It's not going to be a fight, I corrected him, watching the city lights flicker outside my window. It's going to be a liquidation. I looked at the screen at the muted group chat where my mother-in-law and brother-in-law were likely already spiraling. I closed the laptop, my heart rate steady, my mind sharp. They wanted a vacation. They wanted to get away from the heavy vibe of postpartum reality. I would make sure this was the last vacation they ever took in their lives. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to cry. I had all the power and they had exactly nothing. The game had changed, and I was the one who had finally realized I was the one holding the board. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the frost-covered lawn as I stood on the porch of the brick house I owned. The biting cold air of the previous night had settled into a crisp, bright winter morning. My view narrowed to the back of the locksmith's heavy canvas jacket. He was a broad-shouldered man named Mike, a commercial contractor I retained exclusively for Apex properties. I watched over his shoulder as his heavy-duty drill bit chewed mercilessly through the brushed nickel of Marcus's expensive smart lock. Mike had not asked any unnecessary questions when I called him at 6 in the morning. He had simply requested the property deed, my corporate LLC identification, and my driver's license. Once he verified that Apex Properties owned the estate, and that I was the sole managing member, he got to work. The high-pitched whine of the drill ceased. Metal crunched, and the digital keypad Marcus had smugly installed just last week fell away, dangling pathetically by a single red wire. Mike gave the heavy mahogany door a firm push. It swung open, revealing the cavernous, silent foyer of the house. "I will get the commercial-grade deadbolts installed on all the entry points, Miss Williams," Mike said, keeping his voice respectful and low. "Give me about an hour to secure the perimeter." "Take your time, Mike," I replied, stepping past him into the entryway. The silence inside the house was absolute, yet the space screamed of an invasion. I stood in the foyer, the physical pain of my C-section reduced to a tight burning line across my lower abdomen, masked entirely by the cold adrenaline flooding my system. I did not feel like a victim returning to the scene of a crime. I felt like an auditor assessing a foreclosed property. Looking straight ahead into the formal living room, my eyes landed immediately on the massive, hideous ceramic urns claiming prime real estate on the floating console tables. They belonged to my mother-in-law, Beatrice. They were imported gaudy pieces of Tuscan pottery painted with garish vines and oversized lemons. They sat exactly where my collection of sleek, minimalist bronze sculptures used to reside. A flash of memory played in my mind. Beatrice standing in this exact spot 2 months ago, casually directing Chad to carry my expensive sculptures out to the garage donation bin. She had waved her manicured hand dismissively, telling Marcus that the house lacked classical warmth, and that her pottery would finally make the place look like a respectable family estate. Marcus had just nodded, telling me to let his mother have her way. because she had a superior eye for interior design. I had remained completely silent that day, watching them replace my curated art with her tacky ceramics, knowing all the while that she was essentially decorating a house she would soon be legally barred from entering. I walked past the living room, my boots making absolutely no sound on the imported hardwood floors. The kitchen was a disaster zone of arrogant celebration. Empty bottles of Veuve Clicquot cluttered the massive marble island. Half-eaten plates of expensive charcuterie were left entirely uncovered, the imported cheeses hardening in the cool air. Chad's muddy hiking boots were kicked off carelessly against the custom white baseboards near the pantry, leaving streaks of dried dirt on the pristine paint. They had thrown a lavish pre-flight party using the credit cards I paid off drinking champagne in the house I owned, before locking me out in the freezing cold. I ignored the mess entirely. I was not here to clean up after tenants who were currently in the process of being permanently evicted. I gripped the wooden banister and made my way up the grand staircase. Each step sent a sharp, involuntary tug through my surgical incision, but I maintained a steady robotic pace. I reached the master suite and pushed the double doors open. The master bedroom looked like a luxury department store had been ransacked. Marcus's entitlement was scattered across every square inch of the room. $5,000 custom-tailored suits were thrown haphazardly over the velvet chaise lounge. Expensive leather loafers were kicked under the edge of the king-sized bed. On his nightstand sat a stack of past-due utility notices. He had shoved them aside to make room for his collection of imported watch boxes. He wanted the prestige of the address without carrying a single ounce of the responsibility. I bypassed his sprawling mess and walked directly into the master bathroom. I headed straight for my vanity. I stopped. The marble countertop, usually lined perfectly with my high-end skincare, was practically barren. I opened the top drawer. Empty. I opened the medicine cabinet. Stripped clean. My La Mer moisturizing creams, the Tom Ford serums I imported from London, the custom blended perfumes that cost more than Marcus made in a week. All of it was completely gone. In their place sat a single half-empty bottle of cheap drugstore lotion. I let out a sharp breath through my nose. Chloe. Marcus's sister had always treated my bathroom like her own personal complimentary Sephora. She would come over for Sunday dinners, and I would later find my expensive foundations missing or my luxury eye creams severely depleted. Whenever I brought it up, Marcus would call me stingy. He would say that family shares and that Chloe just wanted to look nice for her job interviews. Clearly, while packing for her luxury vacation to the Bahamas, Chloe had decided to thoroughly raid my vanity, stealing thousands of dollars worth of cosmetics, because she felt entirely entitled to the lifestyle I had built. I did not shed a tear over the stolen items. Let her slather her face in stolen serums on the beach. It would be the last luxury she ever experienced at my expense. I turned away from the vanity and walked into my walk-in closet. I pulled down a sleek black leather duffel bag from the top shelf. I unzipped it and began to pack with ruthless, calculated efficiency. I bypassed the designer dresses and the expensive jewelry. Those were material things. They were insured and they could easily be replaced by the revenue my agency generated in a single afternoon. I was here exclusively for the things that mattered, the things that represented leverage and power. I moved to the back corner of the closet, pushing aside a row of winter coats to reveal the biometric wall safe hidden behind a false panel. I pressed my thumb against the glass scanner. The heavy steel door clicked open instantly. I reached inside and pulled out a thick waterproof binder. I opened it to verify the contents. My passport, Malik's newly issued birth certificate, his social security paperwork. I flipped to the next section. The original notarized deed to the property clearly showing Apex Properties, LLC, as the sole owner. The corporate incorporation documents establishing me as the sole managing member. The meticulous, damning financial ledgers proving that every single cent used to purchase this estate came directly from my agency's business accounts. I placed the heavy binder carefully into the bottom of the black duffel bag. Next, I walked down the hall to Malik's nursery. This was the only room in the entire house that I had fiercely protected from Beatrice's invasive decorating habits. The room was painted a soothing sage green, furnished with clean, modern pieces. I grabbed a large stack of fresh diapers, several packages of sensitive baby wipes, and a week's worth of warm fleece-lined onesies. I folded them neatly, packing them into the bag alongside my legal documents. I grabbed my comfortable nursing clothes, a pair of reliable sneakers, and my laptop. Nothing else. I stood in the center of the hallway, the heavy black duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I looked down at the sprawling, silent house. I was leaving behind tens of thousands of dollars in furniture, art, and electronics. I was leaving behind Marcus's absurd wardrobe and Beatrice's hideous pottery. I was leaving the empty champagne bottles and the muddy boots. I was leaving the entire illusion of the happy, prosperous family that they had so desperately tried to project to the world. I walked back down the staircase, the weight of the bag grounding me. The physical pain in my stomach was entirely overshadowed by the towering, undeniable strength of my own independence. Mike was waiting in the foyer when I reached the bottom step. The front door was closed. In place of Marcus's sleek digital smart lock, there was now a heavy industrial-grade brass deadbolt. It looked imposing. It looked permanent. "All access points have been fully secured, Ms. Williams," Mike said, handing me a ring holding two thick, uniquely cut brass keys. "These are high-security commercial locks. They cannot be bumped, picked, or drilled without industrial equipment. And the keys cannot be duplicated at a standard hardware store. You are the only person who has access to this property." "Thank you, Mike," I said, slipping the heavy keys into my pocket. "Send the invoice directly to the Apex Corporate Billing Department. I will authorize the payment this afternoon." "Will do. Stay safe, ma'am," he said, giving me a respectful nod before letting himself out through the front door, pulling it firmly shut behind him. The heavy click of the commercial latch engaging echoed loudly through the empty foyer. I stood alone in the entryway for one final moment. I looked at the trash can near the door. Resting right on top of the garbage was Marcus's discarded digital keypad. The wires severed, the screen cracked from Mike's drill. The device Marcus had used just yesterday to lock his newborn son out in the freezing cold was now nothing but useless plastic and broken glass. I turned the brass handle of the new deadbolt, locking the house from the inside. I walked through the kitchen, out the back door, and locked the commercial-grade patio lock behind me. I stepped into the crisp morning air, the heavy black bag secure on my shoulder, carrying the absolute destruction of my husband's entire reality. The taxi navigated the winding roads away from the suburban neighborhood, eventually pulling into the private, brightly lit underground garage of a sleek glass high-rise in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The driver helped me carefully unload my black duffel bag and Malik's car seat. His eyes still heavy with unspoken concern, but I offered him a polite, reassuring smile and a generous cash tip. I did not need pity. I needed privacy. I carried my sleeping son through the biometric security gates, the heavy reinforced steel doors sliding shut behind me with a reassuring mechanical thud, sealing away the cold and the chaos of the outside world. The private elevator shot smoothly up to the top floor, opening directly into my penthouse. I had purchased this property 3 years ago through a blind trust. It was originally intended to be a secure corporate asset, a quiet, luxurious place to host high-net-worth clients flying in from out of state. It had quickly become my personal sanctuary, a silent escape from the suffocating, performative existence of being Marcus's wife. Now it was my fortress. The ambient temperature inside the apartment was a perfect 72 degrees. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline. Millions of glittering lights stretched out beneath me, a stark contrast to the dark, freezing porch I had been standing on just an hour ago. I gently set Malik's carrier down on the plush custom velvet sofa in the center of the living room. He let out a soft, contented sigh, remaining fast asleep, completely unaware of the massive storm brewing in his parents' lives. My C-section incision burned with a sharp, insistent throbbing, punishing me for the physical exertion of the evening. I walked into the pristine marble kitchen, poured myself a glass of iced water, and took my prescribed pain medication. The physical ache was intense, but the psychological relief of being behind reinforced walls was far stronger. I was safe. My son was safe. The illusion was finally over. I sank deep into the cushions of the sofa, letting the quiet luxury of the room wash over me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was littered with missed calls and messages from random family members who were likely trying to mediate the situation, but I ignored them all. I tapped the Instagram icon. My thumb hovered over the search bar, but I did not even need to type her name. The algorithm knew exactly what I was looking for. Chloe, my eternally entitled sister-in-law, had just updated her story and pushed a fresh photo to her main grid. The location tag proudly arrogantly displayed the name of an exclusive ultra-luxury resort in the Bahamas. The image was a masterpiece of unearned arrogance and toxic family dynamics. The camera angle was slightly shaky, capturing the vibrant energy of their newly started vacation. It featured Chad looking incredibly smug, lounging on a pristine white cabana bed. He was holding a sweating martini glass toward the lens, wearing a pair of designer sunglasses that I distinctly remembered paying the credit card bill for just last month. Behind him, the impossibly turquoise waters of the Caribbean sparkled under the midday sun. Beatrice was visible in the background, getting a massage from a resort attendant under a swaying palm tree. But it was the caption below the photo that truly captured the breathtaking delusion of the entire family. Huge shout out to the best brother in the entire world, Marcus, for completely funding this luxury getaway, Chloe had typed, decorating the text with a string of tropical drink and palm tree emojis. The man works 60-hour weeks to support a completely useless wife who does nothing but complain and drag him down. He deserves to be treated like an absolute king today. Here is to leaving the toxic dead weight back in the cold and living our absolute best lives. I stared at the glowing pixels, a useless wife, toxic dead weight, leaving me in the cold. They were actually bragging about abandoning a postpartum mother and a newborn baby. They were wearing their cruelty like a badge of honor, wrapping their vile behavior in a twisted narrative of self-care and brotherly generosity. They honestly believed their own lies. They had convinced themselves that my quiet demeanor was weakness, that my refusal to brag about my agency's income meant I had absolutely no money of my own. They thought they had won the ultimate victory. I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow. There were no tears left to cry. The grief and anger that had ignited on my front porch had fully crystallized into something terrifyingly cold and sharp. I tapped the comment icon under Chloe's post. I did not write a long emotional paragraph defending my honor. I did not explain to her hundreds of followers that I was the one actually paying for the cabana, the martini, and the first-class flights that got them there. I did not demand an apology or threaten to expose them. Engaging with their delusion would only validate it. It would give them the dramatic, hysterical reaction they were desperately hoping to provoke. I typed a single character, a period, just one tiny dot. I hit send. That single period was not a typo. It was a digital read receipt. It was my way of looking them dead in the eye across an ocean and saying, I see exactly what you are doing, and I am documenting every single second of it. It was a marker, a quiet placeholder for the absolute devastation that was about to rain down upon their perfectly filtered vacation. The reaction was instantaneous. Marcus was clearly glued to his phone, desperately seeking validation from his sister's followers, feeding his fragile ego with their supportive comments. Less than 30 seconds after my single dot went live, my screen lit up with an incoming call from his number. I stared at his smiling contact photo for a brief second before hitting the red decline button, sending him straight to voicemail. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of hearing my voice. I was not going to let him scream over me or gaslight me into an argument while I recovered in my own home. Denied the ability to yell, he immediately resorted to text messages. They flooded into my phone, a rapid-fire sequence of unhinged, narcissistic fury. The vibration buzzed violently against the palm of my hand. "What is wrong with you?" the first message demanded. "Are you stalking my family's social media now? You are psychotic. Delete that comment right now, Nia. Stop embarrassing yourself. You are acting like a crazy toxic stalker." I simply watched the text bubbles appear one after another. I did not type a reply. The absolute silence on my end was clearly driving him insane. His fragile, inflated ego could not handle the perceived disrespect of a single punctuation mark. He needed me to engage. He needed me to fight back so he could play the victim, so he could turn to Chloe and Beatrice and show them how unreasonable and hysterical his postpartum wife was being. When I continued to ignore him, his tone shifted dramatically. He moved away from defensive anger and went straight to outright threats. He pulled out the only weapon he truly believed he possessed, the ultimate tool of control he thought would bring me to my knees. Financial dominance. "You want to play games?" He typed the messages arriving in quick succession. "Fine, let us play. I warned you not to ruin this trip for me. I am logging into the bank portal right now. I am turning off your access to the joint checking account. I am canceling the supplemental credit cards I gave you. You think you can disrespect my family and still live off my hard-earned money? Think again. Let us see how long that toxic attitude lasts when you are completely cut off. Good luck paying for groceries or ordering your little Uber rides. You can sit in your cousin's apartment and starve for all I care. Maybe 2 weeks without my money will teach you how to be a supportive, grateful wife. Do not bother calling me crying when your cards get declined at the store." I read the final thread, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. I reclined against the plush velvet pillows of the sofa. I reached into my bag, pulled out my sleek silver laptop, and rested it carefully on my knees. Marcus was threatening to cut off my access to the joint checking account. The joint checking account that currently held exactly $412 entirely funded by his last meager commission check. He was threatening to cancel the supplemental credit cards, the premium high-limit metal cards that were legally attached to my primary corporate account. I had simply issued those cards in his name 3 years ago to help boost his disastrous credit score after his failed investments nearly bankrupted him. He had spent so long swiping that sleek card to pay for expensive dinners and luxury vacations that he had genuinely forgotten whose name was actually on the master account. He had forgotten who the bank actually answered to. He did not have the power to cancel my cards. I had the absolute unilateral power to cancel his. I opened my banking application. The secure dashboard loaded, displaying the massive, healthy balances of my corporate and personal portfolios. I navigated directly to the corporate card management tab. I clicked on the active users list. There was Marcus's card currently showing a pending authorization for $3,500 at a high-end Bahamian steakhouse. He was probably treating the entire table to Wagyu beef and imported wine right this very second, assuming the massive bill would simply vanish into the ether of our monthly statements as it always did. He truly believed he was the master of our financial universe. He believed that by clicking a button on his phone, he was sentencing me to poverty and starvation. The sheer magnitude of his arrogance was breathtaking. I clicked on the settings icon next to his specific card number. A drop-down menu appeared on the bright screen. I scrolled past the option to temporarily pause the card and hovered my cursor directly over the option labeled "Report Stolen and Terminate." I did not click it yet. I wanted him to enjoy his appetizer. I wanted the main courses to arrive. I wanted him to confidently hand that heavy metal card to the waiter with a smug, self-satisfied grin, eager to show his mother and brother-in-law what a highly successful provider he was. I wanted him to experience the exact moment of crushing public humiliation he had so casually inflicted upon me for the last 4 years. My phone vibrated again against the sofa cushion. Another text from Marcus illuminated the screen. "You brought this on yourself, Nia. Enjoy being broke." I took a screenshot of the entire message thread. Every threat, every insult, every blatant admission of financial abuse was immediately uploaded to a secure cloud drive shared directly with my divorce attorney. Marcus was building my legal case for me brick by brick, text by text. He was handing over irrefutable documented proof of emotional abuse and financial abandonment on a silver platter. I looked out over the glittering city of Atlanta. I was not a helpless dependent wife shivering on a porch. I was the CEO of my own life, sitting in a multi-million-dollar penthouse, holding the absolute power to systematically dismantle the false reality my husband had constructed. I typed a reply. My first and only response to his barrage of unhinged threats. "I hope the steak is good, Marcus." I hit send. Then I turned my attention back to my laptop screen, moved my cursor over the bright red terminate button, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The digital confirmation flashed across my screen in a stark, uncompromising green. Marcus's corporate card was officially terminated. Right about now, the waiter at that high-end Bahamian steakhouse was returning to the table holding a black leather check presenter and quietly informing the man of the house that his premium metal card had been declined. I closed the banking portal with a sharp tap of my trackpad. The time for petty social media games and reactive text messages was over. I pushed the laptop back slightly, sitting up straight in my ergonomic chair. The soft, ambient lighting of the penthouse illuminated my face, catching the hard, unyielding focus in my eyes. I was no longer the discarded, bleeding woman crying on a freezing porch. I was stepping back into the skin I wore best. I was the managing director of a highly lucrative investment portfolio, and it was time to liquidate a toxic asset. I picked up my phone and bypassed my personal contacts entirely, navigating straight to my encrypted corporate directory. I dialed the direct line of Richard Sterling, the senior partner at the ruthless real estate law firm that handled all acquisitions and dispositions for Apex Properties, LLC. Richard answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional despite the late hour. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I gave him a direct, uncompromising directive. I wanted the primary residence on Oakwood Drive sold, and I wanted the title transferred before the end of the current business week. Richard paused, the sound of his pen tapping against his mahogany desk echoing through the speaker. He reminded me of the standard realities of the American real estate market. He warned me that listing a premium property in that particular zip code required professional staging, multiple open houses, and a minimum of 30 to 60 days in escrow just to navigate the grueling mortgage underwriting process for a retail buyer. He told me that pushing for anything faster was practically impossible unless I was willing to take a massive financial loss. I stopped his lecture immediately. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the glass desk, my voice dropping into a tone of absolute chilling authority. I reminded Richard that we were not putting a sign in the front yard. We were not dealing with retail buyers who needed bank approvals, property appraisals, or 30-day inspection contingencies. The house on Oakwood Drive was not legally a private residence. It was a corporate asset, fully owned free and clear by Apex Properties, LLC. I was not selling a family home. I was executing a direct corporate asset transfer. I laid out the legal mechanics of the strategy precisely, so there would be absolutely no misunderstanding. Under United States real estate law, when a property is entirely owned by an LLC and sold to a corporate cash buyer, the transaction bypasses the entire traditional retail market. There is no waiting for a bank to underwrite a loan, because there is no loan. There is no mandatory waiting period for federal mortgage disclosures. When two corporations agree on a cash price for an asset, the title company only needs enough time to run a clean title search and verify the wire transfer. The entire legal process, from the signing of the purchase agreement to the final closing and recording of the deed, takes exactly 7 days. Richard's tone shifted instantly from cautious advisor to an obedient executor. He understood the assignment. He asked me who the target buyer was. I already had the answer prepared. I told him to initiate contact with Vanguard Acquisitions, a massive institutional investment group that specialized in buying premium suburban properties for cash and turning them into high-end corporate rentals. Vanguard had been quietly trying to break into the Oakwood Drive neighborhood for 2 years, but the Homeowners Association actively discouraged traditional sales to corporate landlords. However, because Vanguard would be purchasing the property directly from my LLC in a private off-market commercial transaction, the neighborhood association would have absolutely no authority to stop the sale or even review the transfer until the ink on the deed was already dry. Within 15 minutes, I was on a secure video conference with the regional acquisitions director for Vanguard. He was a sharp, aggressive man sitting in a glass office in Chicago, completely unaware of the domestic war he was about to fund. He saw only a highly desirable property being offered off-market by a motivated corporate seller. I shared my screen presenting the recent property appraisals, the tax records, and the pristine condition of the estate. I controlled the negotiation with brutal efficiency. I laid my terms out on the table with zero room for negotiation. I offered Vanguard the property at a flat 10% discount under its current appraised market value. In exchange for that discount, they had to agree to 3 non-negotiable conditions. First, they were buying the property completely, as is waiving all physical inspection contingencies. Second, the entire purchase price had to be wired into the Apex Properties escrow account by noon on the 7th day. Third, and most importantly, they had to sign a strict non-disclosure agreement preventing them from sending any representatives, inspectors, or appraisers to the physical property until the closing was officially complete and the deed was recorded. The director hesitated for only a fraction of a second. A 10% discount on a pristine property in that neighborhood was millions of dollars in instant equity for his firm. It was an incredibly lucrative deal wrapped in a bow. He agreed to the terms immediately. He promised the preliminary purchase contract would be in my inbox within the hour. I ended the video call and sat back in the quiet luxury of the penthouse. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the massive invisible machinery I had just set into motion. I pulled up the calendar on my computer screen, calculating the exact timeline of Marcus's luxurious Bahamian getaway. Marcus had texted me that he would see me in 2 weeks. 14 days. He thought he had 14 days to drink expensive cocktails, lounge on white sand beaches, and bask in the admiration of his enabling family while I supposedly suffered in misery at home. The math was beautiful. It was poetic in its absolute ruthlessness. By day 7 of his vacation, the house on Oakwood Drive would legally cease to belong to me. The title would transfer to Vanguard Acquisitions. On day 8, Vanguard's aggressive property management team would arrive at the estate. They would find a house filled with custom designer suits, expensive watches, and a massive collection of hideous Tuscan pottery. According to the strict terms of the commercial lease agreement I was drafting to accompany the sale, any personal property left inside the residence, after the closing date, would be legally classified as abandoned corporate debris. Vanguard did not mess around with abandoned property. They would not carefully pack Marcus's suits into boxes. They would not bubble wrap Beatrice's imported ceramics. They would hire a third-party liquidation crew to bring a commercial dumpster straight to the driveway. Everything Marcus valued, everything he used to project his false image of wealth and success would be unceremoniously tossed into a trash compactor and hauled away to a local landfill long before his return flight even took off from Nassau. A soft chime from my laptop broke the silence. The purchase agreement from Vanguard Acquisitions had arrived in my inbox. Attached to it was the required escrow wire instruction form. I opened the document, reading through the dense legal jargon with the practiced eye of a seasoned investor. Every clause was perfectly aligned with my demands. The 7-day closing timeline was highlighted in bold ink. The waiver of all inspections was firmly locked into the contract language. I scrolled to the bottom of the final page. There was a glowing yellow box indicating where my biometric signature was required to legally bind the transaction. I placed my finger on the trackpad. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single pang of regret for the home I was signing away. That house was never a home. It was a stage set built to prop up the ego of a weak, disloyal man, and I was simply canceling the production. I executed the signature. The software processed the encrypted data, stamping the legal document with an undeniable mark of finality. A green checkmark appeared on the screen confirming that the contract was legally binding and had been automatically routed to the escrow agents. The countdown had officially begun. I reached for my phone, sliding it across the glass desk. The screen was dark and completely silent. There were no new text messages from Marcus. There were no more threats about cutting off my access to cash. There were no more arrogant posts from Chloe about living their best lives in the Caribbean. The sudden radio silence from the Bahamas was deafening. I knew exactly what that silence meant. The reality of the declined credit card had finally hit them. Marcus was currently trapped in a high-end restaurant in a foreign country, staring at a massive bill he could not possibly pay, frantically trying to figure out why his bank access was denied. He was realizing that his safety net had vanished. He thought a declined card was the ultimate punishment. He thought he was experiencing the worst embarrassment of his life in front of his mother and brother-in-law. He had absolutely no idea that the declined card was just a minor inconvenience, a tiny opening act. He had no idea that while he was arguing with a restaurant manager over a dinner bill, I had just legally wiped his entire existence off the map. I locked my laptop screen and stood up from the desk. I walked over to the velvet sofa and looked down at Malik, who was sleeping soundly, completely safe from the toxicity of the family that had discarded him. I gently pulled the soft cashmere blanket higher up over his small shoulders. We were safe. We were secure. And exactly 7 days from now, we would be completely untethered from the dead weight of Marcus's delusions. I turned off the overhead light, leaving only the soft glow of the city skyline pouring through the windows, and waited for the clock to run out. The following morning, the sun broke across the Atlanta skyline, pouring a harsh, brilliant light into the penthouse. The silence was absolute. My phone remained face down on the glass desk, completely dead to the outside world, having received no further communications since I terminated Marcus's corporate card. The time for digital skirmishes had passed. I was ready to execute the final, most devastating phase of my legal strategy. I opened my laptop, pulling up the secure portal for Vanguard acquisitions. Richard, my real estate attorney, had worked through the night to finalize the specific addendums I requested. We were scheduled for a final video conference with Vanguard's regional liquidation coordinator to lock in the absolute terms of the transfer. The video window popped open, revealing Richard in his home office and a sharply dressed executive named Greg sitting in Vanguard's corporate headquarters. I leaned slowly forward, moving closer to the glowing monitor, the cool blue light washing over my face as my eyes locked onto the specific legal phrasing of the final contract. Section 4, Paragraph B, the exact clause that would obliterate Marcus's entire physical reality. I had authorized Richard to drop the asking price by an additional 5% overnight, bringing the total discount to a steep 15% below appraised market value. To an amateur, surrendering that much equity might seem like a panicked, emotional mistake. To a corporate investor, it was a highly calculated strike. That 15% margin was the ultimate premium I paid to guarantee speed, absolute silence, and a total waiver of liability. It was the price of a flawless execution. "The revised contract looks perfect on our end, Ms. Williams," Greg said, his voice a smooth, practiced corporate drone. "Vanguard is prepared to wire the full purchase amount to your escrow account by Friday morning. We just need verbal confirmation on the physical state of the property upon transfer. The addendum explicitly states an as-is conveyance." "That is correct, Greg," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. "The property is being sold strictly as is, no repairs, no cleaning, and absolutely no preservation of the current contents." To the average retail homebuyer, an as-is clause simply means the seller refuses to fix a leaky roof or replace an outdated water heater. But in the ruthless world of commercial LLC to LLC real estate transactions, as-is carries a much heavier, far more destructive legal definition. It means the purchasing corporation is buying the physical structure and unequivocally inheriting every single piece of physical property, debris, and chattel currently trapped within its walls. The moment the deed is recorded and the funds clear, the escrow account, the previous owner's rights, vanish completely. Anything left inside the residence is legally classified as abandoned corporate waste. Understood? Greg nodded, typing notes into his own system. "Our primary objective with this specific estate is a rapid conversion into our luxury short-term rental portfolio. We plan to list it on the premium tier of Airbnb within 3 weeks. That means my crew needs to gut the interior completely. I need to confirm that you hold no attachment to the personal property currently inside. My liquidation team does not pack boxes. They do not sort. They do not ship items to secondary locations. I hold absolutely no attachment to anything inside that house, I assured him, keeping my eyes fixed on the screen. You are free to handle the liquidation exactly according to your standard operating procedures. Excellent, Greg said. Our protocol is simple. On the morning of closing, we dispatch a 40-yard roll-off commercial dumpster directly to the driveway. A crew of 6 contractors will sweep the property. Anything not permanently bolted to the drywall is pitched into the bin. If it is too heavy, we break it down. If it is too bulky, we smash it. We clear the footprint entirely so our interior design team can bring in the new staging furniture by Monday. I listened to Greg outline the brutal, unfeeling mechanics of corporate property liquidation, and a profound sense of poetic justice settled deep into my bones. I thought about Chad, Marcus's deadbeat freeloading brother who had proudly occupied my third guest bedroom for the last 8 months without paying a single dime in rent. Chad had spent an entire month meticulously building a massive custom gaming PC rig. He had purchased dual curved monitors, high-end graphics cards, and LED cooling fans, all using money he had begged off Marcus. I had paid the inflated electric bills while Chad sat in that dark room screaming into a headset and leaving empty energy drink cans scattered across my hardwood floors. He treated that computer setup like it was the crown jewel of his existence. To Greg's liquidation crew, Chad's prized gaming rig was nothing more than heavy, cumbersome e-waste. It would be ripped from the wall, its expensive cables severed without a second thought, and violently hurled over the rusted metal edge of a commercial dumpster. The screens would shatter. The graphics cards would be crushed beneath the weight of ordinary household trash. All of Chad's digital achievements, his saved data, his arrogant pride would end up buried in a municipal landfill before he even finished his luxury vacation. Then there was Beatrice, my mother-in-law, who believed her mere presence elevated the status of my home. I thought about the massive, hideous Tuscan pottery urns she had arrogantly placed in my formal living room after demanding my own art be thrown into the garage. Beatrice had spent hours bragging to her friends about those oversized, garish lemons painted on the imported ceramics, claiming they brought authentic European class to my otherwise sterile house. I could vividly picture Greg's contractors walking into the foyer in their heavy work boots. They would not carefully wrap Beatrice's precious pottery in protective bubble wrap. They would not recognize the imported value she claimed they held. They would see oversized, heavy ceramic objects taking up too much valuable space in the roll-off bin. One of the men would simply grab a sledgehammer and smash Beatrice's beloved Tuscan urns into 1,000 jagged pieces right there on the driveway, sweeping the colorful shards into a heavy-duty trash bag like broken glass from a dive bar. The physical manifestation of her matriarchal dominance would be reduced to actual rubble. And finally, I thought of Marcus, the man who had locked me out of my own property, leaving me bleeding and terrified in the freezing cold because he wanted to exert ultimate control. He had left his custom-tailored Italian suits strewn across the master suite. He had left his collection of flashy, oversized watches resting on the nightstand. He valued those superficial status symbols more than he valued the mother of his newborn child. Greg had been very clear about the protocol for abandoned textiles and personal accessories. The liquidation crew would sweep through the master closet with massive black contractor bags. Marcus's $5,000 suits would be ripped from their velvet hangers, crumpled together, and tossed into the back of a junk removal truck. His watch boxes would be swept off the nightstand and pitched into the garbage along with empty shampoo bottles and discarded mail. His entire carefully curated wardrobe, the armor he wore to project his fake wealth to the world, would be treated as nothing more than soiled rags. They had all boarded a plane to the Bahamas feeling like untouchable royalty. They had toasted to their success, mocking the woman who had quietly funded every single aspect of their privileged existence. They thought they had secured the ultimate victory by leaving me locked out in the cold. They had absolutely no idea that by walking out that door and leaving their possessions behind, they had legally surrendered everything they owned to a faceless, ruthless corporate machine. They did not understand that the real estate market did not care about Marcus's ego, Beatrice's pride, or Chad's entitlement. The market only recognized signed contracts and cleared funds. "I approve of your protocol, Greg," I said, breaking the brief silence. "I want the property swept completely clean. Leave absolutely nothing behind." "Consider it done, Ms. Williams," Greg replied. "I will cue the contract for final execution. It has been a pleasure doing business with Apex Properties." The video call disconnected, leaving me alone with the digital document on my screen. The final signature block glowed yellow, waiting for my authorization. I reached out and pressed my finger against the biometric scanner on my laptop. The system authenticated my identity instantly. My digital signature populated across the bottom of the page, locking the contract, sealing the 15% discount, and permanently authorizing the as-is liquidation of the Oakwood Drive estate. The green confirmation banner flashed across the top of my monitor. The transaction was complete. The house was sold. The liquidation crew was officially booked. I sat back in my chair looking out over the city. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of calm. There was no anger left, no lingering resentment, no desire to scream or argue. I had simply removed the tumor from my life with surgical precision. Marcus had threatened to cut off my credit cards and watch me starve. He had attempted to use money to break my spirit. In return, I had utilized the absolute power of corporate law to erase his entire physical life. When he returned from his sunny vacation, he would not find a house. He would find a high-end corporate Airbnb managed by strangers, with a new family sleeping in what used to be his bedroom and all of his precious belongings decaying at the bottom of a city dump. The game was over, and I was the only one left sitting at the board. I remained in my ergonomic chair as the morning sun climbed higher over the Atlanta skyline. The harsh, brilliant light cast sharp, angular shadows across the penthouse, framing me from below in the dark reflection of the glass desk. I was perched at the absolute summit of my own world, looking down at the frantic, microscopic movements of the people who had tried to bury me. The silence of the room was punctuated by a soft, rhythmic chime from my secondary monitor. I had set up a dedicated inbox rule for the joint personal email account Marcus and I historically shared for basic household expenses. He had never bothered to change the password. He never bothered to manage the administrative side of his own life, assuming I would always be there to handle the tedious details. When I terminated his primary corporate card last night, I knew exactly what his reaction would be. Marcus did not possess the humility to look his mother, his sister, and his freeloading brother in the eye and admit he had been cut off. He could not tolerate looking weak in front of Chad. Instead, Marcus would have feigned annoyance, blamed a random bank security protocol, and reached into the back of his designer leather wallet for his personal credit cards. These were cards with brutal 24% interest rates. Cards he had explicitly promised me he would keep at a zero balance. The digital receipts began rolling into the inbox like a ticker tape of financial suicide. I opened the first notification. It was an alert from Chase Bank. $7,500. The memo line detailed a full-day private catamaran rental complete with a dedicated crew and a premium imported liquor package. Chloe and Chad needed a luxurious aesthetic backdrop for their social media performance, and Marcus was bleeding cash to provide it. 2 hours later, another email arrived, a charge for $1,200 at the resort's elite wellness spa. Beatrice was undoubtedly enjoying a hot stone massage and a caviar facial, blissfully unaware that her golden child was swiping a card that was rapidly approaching its absolute maximum limit. Later that evening, a staggering $4,000 authorization cleared for a Michelin-starred seafood restaurant on the island. I could visualize the scene perfectly. Marcus sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table, a forced rigid smile plastered across his face as he aggressively encouraged everyone to order the twin lobster tails and the imported truffles. He was sweating beneath his linen shirt, his heart hammering against his ribs every time the waiter walked away with his card, silently praying the transaction would clear. He was funding an illusion. He was paying a massive premium just to keep up the charade that he was the benevolent, infinitely wealthy patriarch of the family. Over the next 48 hours, the notifications did not slow down. The emails painted a vivid picture of a man spiraling entirely out of control, driven by ego and fear. There were charges for jet ski rentals. There were daily, premium VIP cabana fees. There was a highly specific transaction for $2,000 at the resort boutique because Chloe had conveniently forgotten to pack her designer sunglasses. The total climbed with terrifying speed. 20,000, 30,000. By the end of day 3, Marcus had racked up just over $40,000 in high-interest unsecured consumer debt. A rational person would be having a severe panic attack. A normal financial broker would understand the catastrophic math of carrying $40,000 in vacation debt while bringing in zero new revenue. But Marcus was insulated by a massive fatal delusion. He was entirely convinced that he possessed an impenetrable safety net. For the last 6 months, Marcus had been loudly boasting to anyone who would listen about the explosive, unprecedented growth of the Atlanta housing market. He had stood in the kitchen of the Oakwood Drive estate, drinking expensive scotch with his colleagues, bragging about the hundreds of thousands of dollars in untapped equity sitting in his property. He viewed the house not as a shelter, but as a giant brick-and-mortar ATM that he could tap into whenever he desired. I knew exactly what his exit strategy was. He planned to ride out this vacation, absorb the exorbitant credit card debt to keep his family worshipping at his feet, and then simply deal with the consequences later. His master plan was to return to Atlanta, walk into a local bank branch, and apply for a home equity line of credit, a HELOC. He fully intended to leverage the primary residence to secure a massive $50,000 cash payout, wipe out the credit cards, and reset the board. He truly believed he was a financial genius leveraging his hard-earned assets. I leaned back and took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced water. The sheer magnitude of his ignorance was almost beautiful to witness. He was banking his entire financial survival on a house he did not own. He was racking up compound interest under the absolute certainty that he could borrow against a deed that was currently sitting in a secure corporate escrow account, waiting to be permanently transferred to a ruthless liquidation firm. He had no idea that you cannot secure a loan against a property when your name is nowhere on the title. He had no idea that he was legally nothing more than a tenant, and a terrible one at that. My screen flashed again, a bright red warning email from Discover Card. Credit limit reached. Transaction declined. Marcus had finally hit the ceiling. He had drained every available drop of his personal credit. I pictured him standing at a tiki bar, arguing quietly with a bartender, his face flushed with embarrassment as the machine rejected his card. He would have to scramble now. He would have to make up new, increasingly absurd lies to explain to Beatrice why they suddenly needed to eat at the hotel buffet instead of the private steakhouse. The vacation was about to take a very sharp, very uncomfortable turn, and yet I knew he would still find a way to justify it. He would endure the final days of the trip, grinding his teeth, comforting himself with the thought of his impending home equity loan. He would sit on the flight back to Atlanta, drafting a mental list of which banks he would call first on Monday morning. He was walking directly toward a cliff, completely blindfolded, whistling a happy tune. I closed my laptop, the screen going dark. I had authorized the sale. I had secured the commercial locks. I had monitored his financial self-destruction. There was nothing left for me to do but wait for Vanguard Acquisitions to clear the wire transfer and dispatch their crew. The board was set. The pieces were locked in place. I stood up, walked into the nursery to check on my sleeping son, and smiled. Marcus was currently enjoying his final hours as a king, entirely unaware that his kingdom had already been reduced to ash. The camera pans smoothly, following the steady, unhurried movement of my hand as I lift a delicate porcelain cup to my lips. I take a slow, measured sip of Earl Grey tea, the bitter bergamot grounding me in the stark reality of the morning. The penthouse around me was bathed in the crisp, brilliant light of the Atlanta sunrise, a sanctuary of absolute undisturbed peace. It was Friday, day 7, closing day. For the past week, my life had been an exercise in supreme detachment. The only disruptions to my quiet existence were the automated, encrypted emails detailing Marcus's frantic, desperate attempts to secure temporary lines of credit on the island after his primary cards were declined. I had watched the digital footprint of his panic, the declined authorizations, the mounting high-interest debt, the desperate swiping with the cold fascination of a scientist observing an insect in a maze. He was bleeding out financially, completely consumed by the immediate terror of a ruined vacation, utterly blind to the guillotine poised over his neck back home. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of temporary cash flow, banking on his eventual return to save him. I was playing a game of total irreversible erasure. I sat at my glass desk, dual monitors glowing softly. On the left screen, the secure banking portal for Apex Properties, LLC, sat open, refreshing its data every 60 seconds. On the right, my encrypted email inbox held the final executed closing disclosure from Richard, my attorney. The title search had come back spotless. There were no hidden liens, no secondary encumbrances, nothing to stall the massive machinery I had set into motion. In the ruthless world of institutional real estate, transactions do not happen with friendly handshakes, celebratory photographs, or ceremonial key handovers. They happen in the cold, unfeeling digital ether. They happen with verified keystrokes and encrypted wire transfers. Vanguard Acquisitions was a highly aggressive firm. They did not leave money floating in escrow over the weekend. They preferred to close early, take immediate possession of the asset, and dispatch their contractors before the morning dew had even dried. I watched the digital clock in the top right corner of my screen. 9:58 a.m., 9:59 a.m. At exactly 10 a.m., the absolute silence of the penthouse was pierced by a sharp, resonant chime from my laptop speakers. I shifted my gaze to the left monitor. The screen refreshed one final time, pulling the newest data directly from the federal wire system. The available balance for Apex Properties, LLC, updated in a blinding flash of green text. $850,000. The funds had cleared. The transaction was fully funded, recorded at the county courthouse, and legally binding. The deed to the sprawling estate on Oakwood Drive was no longer in my name, nor was it shielded by my holding company. It belonged entirely to a faceless corporate conglomerate that specialized in rapid, unfeeling property turnover. I placed my teacup back on its saucer, the faint clink echoing through the room. $850,000 in liquid cash, safely secured in a corporate account that Marcus did not even know existed, tied to an LLC he had absolutely no legal right to access. It was the ultimate flawless liquidation of a toxic asset. But the digital transfer of funds was only the first half of the equation. The second, far more visceral half was happening 30 miles away in the manicured, highly restricted suburban enclave of Oakwood Drive. Vanguard Acquisitions operated with military efficiency. The exact second that wire transfer cleared, the property transitioned from a private luxury home into an active commercial job site. I had received an automated text from Greg's logistics team exactly 5 minutes prior, confirming that their crew was already turning onto the street. I didn't need to be standing on the sidewalk to see it. The operational protocol of a corporate flip is a well-documented, brutal science. Right about now, a massive 40-yard steel roll-off commercial dumpster was backing its way up the pristine concrete driveway of the estate. The heavy, grinding diesel engine of the transport truck would be echoing through the quiet, affluent neighborhood, the air brakes hissing loudly, undoubtedly causing the nosy neighbors to part their custom plantation blinds in shock. The Oakwood Homeowners Association strictly prohibited commercial dumpsters without a 30-day prior approval process and a formal committee hearing. But Vanguard Acquisitions didn't care about neighborhood covenants or angry HOA presidents. By the time the board managed to draft a furious cease and desist letter, the interior of the house would already be completely gutted. A crew of 6 burly contractors wearing heavy steel-toed boots and high-visibility vests would be approaching the custom mahogany front door. They didn't have a key. They didn't need one. Vanguard's standard operating procedure for properties acquired under a strict as-is liquidation clause with abandoned chattel was absolute zero tolerance for delays. Marcus had recently installed a state-of-the-art $1,000 smart lock on that door, linking it to his phone so he could monitor exactly who came and went. It was a digital manifestation of his obsessive need for control. He thought that encrypted piece of hardware made his fortress impenetrable. I could almost hear the aggressive, high-pitched whine of an industrial power drill biting into the expensive brushed metal. It would take Vanguard's crew less than 3 minutes to bore straight through the smart lock's core, destroying the expensive mechanism and forcing the heavy deadbolt to yield. The massive door would swing open, permanently breaching the sacred threshold of Marcus's carefully curated reality. The contractors would step into the grand foyer, their dusty work boots tracking dirt across the imported Turkish tile Marcus had spent weeks bragging about to his colleagues. They wouldn't pause to admire the sweeping staircase or the custom crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling. They were on the clock, and they were getting paid by the hour to destroy. The crew foreman would look down at his tablet confirming the as-is liquidation addendum and give the simple order to clear the footprint. It would begin in the formal living room. Beatrice's prized Tuscan pottery, the hideous, oversized painted urns she claimed were priceless European heirlooms, would be the very first casualties. A contractor would wrap his thick-gloved hands around the oversized ceramics, haul them out the front door, and heave them directly over the high steel wall of the dumpster. The shattering, explosive crash of the imported pottery would signal the official end of her suffocating matriarchal reign over my space. There would be no protective bubble wrap, no careful storage, no reverence for her perceived status, just ceramic dust mixing with ordinary construction debris. Upstairs in the third guest room, the crew would encounter Chad's pathetic, unearned kingdom. The custom-built gaming PC, the dual-curved LED monitors, the expensive mechanical keyboard, and the high-end graphics cards, the entire setup he had painstakingly assembled, using money he had siphoned directly from his brother. The contractors wouldn't recognize it as a high-end technical rig. To them, it was just heavy, cumbersome electronic junk left behind by an evicted tenant. They would not gently unplug the components. They would rip the thick power cords directly from the wall outlets. The expensive monitors would be tossed unceremoniously into heavy-duty black contractor bags, the delicate glass screens cracking against the sharp edges of Chad's empty energy drink cans and discarded takeout containers. All of his digital achievements, his saved data, and his arrogant pride would end up buried in a municipal landfill before he even finished his luxury vacation. But the true, undeniable masterpiece of this demolition would take place in the master suite. Marcus's massive walk-in closet was his sanctuary, a meticulously organized shrine to his own massive ego. Racks of custom-tailored Italian suits, shelves of expensive polished leather shoes, and drawers filled with silk ties and designer watches. He believed these items commanded respect. He believed they elevated him above the people he stepped on to acquire them. The cleanup crew would show absolutely no reverence for his precious designer labels. They would pull massive industrial-grade trash bags from their tool belts and begin sweeping their arms aggressively across the velvet hangers. Thousands of dollars of bespoke tailoring would be crumpled together, shoved violently into plastic, and dragged down the carpeted stairs like bags of wet yard clippings. His expensive leather loafers would be thrown in by the handful, scuffed and crushed beneath the weight of his own discarded arrogance. The boxes containing his flashy watches would be swept off the nightstand and pitched into the garbage, along with empty shampoo bottles and junk mail. The entire wardrobe he used to project his fake wealth to the world would be treated as nothing more than soiled, abandoned rags. Within 3 hours, the house would be entirely unrecognizable. The plush, arrogant comfort of Marcus's existence would be stripped down to bare drywall, exposed floorboards, and echoey empty rooms. Every photograph, every piece of mail, every single physical item that anchored his identity to that property would be loaded onto a truck and hauled away completely unrecoverable. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, my breathing perfectly steady, my pulse completely calm. I didn't feel a single trace of guilt. Guilt is an emotion reserved for those who cause unwarranted harm. I was simply a balancing force, a natural, inevitable consequence of their unchecked greed and profound cruelty. They had pushed me out the door expecting me to freeze and break, completely ignorant of the fact that I had spent years quietly owning the very ground they stood on. When they tried to pull the rug out from under me, they didn't realize they were ripping up their own foundation. I checked the Vanguard portal one last time. The property status had officially updated from pending to acquired and in liquidation. Marcus was scheduled to fly back to Atlanta on Sunday afternoon. He had exactly 48 hours left to soak in the Caribbean sun, 2 days to drink watered-down resort cocktails, and spin increasingly desperate lies to his mother and brother about why his credit cards were mysteriously frozen. 48 hours to convince himself that as soon as he touched down in Georgia, he would simply walk into a bank, leverage the equity in his beautiful suburban home, and fix his temporary cash flow problem with a massive loan. He was a man living on borrowed time in a completely borrowed reality. The digital transfer was finalized. The physical purge was actively underway. The house on Oakwood Drive no longer belonged to Apex Properties, and it certainly no longer belonged to him. I closed the banking tab and locked my computer screen. The trap was sprung, the jaws were locked tight, and all I had to do now was wait for him to take that fateful Uber ride home from the airport. The days following the liquidation passed with the quiet, rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. Day 8, Day 9, Day 10. Vanguard Acquisitions worked with terrifying speed. Through public municipal records and the digital notifications attached to my former utility accounts, I monitored their progress from the comfort of my penthouse. The power was briefly shut off and transferred to a corporate holding account. The water bill was settled and closed out. By day 11, Vanguard's aggressive staging team had already swept through the gutted rooms, filling the void left by Marcus's destroyed possessions with sleek, generic high-end rental furniture. The estate on Oakwood Drive was completely wiped clean of our history, sanitized and reborn as a sterile corporate asset. Then came day 12. I was standing in the kitchen pouring a fresh cup of black coffee when the screen of my phone suddenly lit up, breaking the week-long silence from the Caribbean. The screen displayed a single incoming text message from Marcus. If there were a camera in this room, it would have been pushing in slowly, tracking the deliberate movement of my hand as I set the coffee mug down, framing a tight, uncompromising close-up of my eyes. The ambient light of the city skyline reflected in my pupils, catching the sharp, undeniable glint of absolute freezing irony. I picked up the device and read the message. It was a masterpiece of patriarchal delusion crafted by a man who was financially drowning, but still desperately clinging to the illusion of his own absolute authority. "We are flying back tomorrow at 2 p.m., the text read. "You had better be home, have the house cleaned, dinner ready, and do not give us that sour face. Chad and Chloe are staying with us for another week." I stared at the glowing letters, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his demands was almost poetic. I analyzed the psychology behind every single word he had typed. Marcus was currently sitting in a humid airport terminal or a downgraded resort lobby, carrying over $40,000 in high-interest unsecured consumer debt on credit cards he could not pay off. He had spent the last 5 days sweating through his linen shirts, silently panicking every time a restaurant check was presented, forced to manufacture increasingly absurd lies to explain his sudden lack of liquidity to his mother and siblings. He was backed into a terrifying financial corner, completely stripped of his actual power. And so, like all weak men backed into a corner, he attempted to project strength by dominating the only person he believed he still controlled. He was using that text message to reassure himself. He needed to believe that his fortress was still intact. He needed to believe that his obedient, terrified wife was currently on her hands and knees, scrubbing the hardwood floors, terrified of his return, thoroughly broken by his previous threats of freezing her bank accounts. He was demanding a hot meal and a submissive smile because he desperately needed to walk through that front door and feel like a king again. And the guests, the absolute hilarity of the guests. Chad and Chloe were staying for another week. The parasites had decided the host had not been bled quite dry enough. They were fully expecting to prolong their free ride. Chloe was undoubtedly anticipating demanding fresh towels and complaining about the commercial flight home while I served her wine. Chad was probably vibrating with excitement at the thought of retreating straight up to the third-floor guest room to drop his bag, sink into his ergonomic gaming chair, and boot up his $5,000 custom PC rig. He had absolutely no idea that his precious dual monitors and LED cooling fans were currently buried under 3 tons of municipal garbage in a DeKalb County landfill. He had no idea the room he intended to sleep in was now painted a sterile corporate gray and locked behind a keypad code he did not possess. They were all expecting to return to a luxurious, welcoming sanctuary. They were expecting the soft glow of the foyer chandelier, the smell of a catered dinner, and the comforting sight of Beatrice's hideous Tuscan pottery guarding the living room. I looked down at the keyboard on my phone. The cursor blinked steadily, waiting for my response. A lesser woman might have engaged. A woman who was still emotionally tethered to this toxic dynamic might have typed out a furious paragraph. She might have screamed through the digital ether, demanding to know how he dared invite his freeloading brother to stay another week without asking. She might have thrown his declined credit cards in his face. She might have threatened, argued, or pleaded. But I was no longer a participant in their twisted family drama. I was the architect of their demise. Engaging with Marcus now would only give him the friction he desired. It would validate his delusion that we were still playing on the same board. I tapped the emoji keyboard. I did not type a single letter. I did not offer a single word of submission nor a single word of defiance. I simply selected the standard yellow thumbs-up icon. I hit send. The blue bubble popped onto the screen, a tiny digital confirmation of receipt. It was the ultimate dismissal. It was a gesture of total hollow compliance that gave him absolutely nothing to push back against. It was the digital equivalent of a blank stare. I could imagine Marcus sitting thousands of miles away looking at that thumbs-up emoji and feeling a surge of arrogant satisfaction. He would show his phone screen to Chad, grinning smugly, proving that he had successfully brought his rebellious wife to heel. He would tell his brother that the house was prepped, the dinner was ordered, and the red carpet was officially rolled out for their grand return. That tiny yellow icon would lull him into a state of total blinding security. It was the final lullaby before the execution. I locked my phone and tossed it casually onto the kitchen island. The trap was perfectly set. The bait had been taken. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., their flight would touch down on the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. By 3 p.m., they would be loading their heavy souvenir-stuffed suitcases into the trunk of a premium ride-share vehicle. They would complain about the Atlanta traffic, exhausted from the travel, eager to return to the sprawling, comfortable estate that validated their collective sense of superiority. They would pull up the long, manicured driveway of Oakwood Drive. Marcus would step out of the vehicle expecting his smart lock to recognize his phone. He would walk up to the heavy mahogany door, fully anticipating it to yield to his touch. Instead, he would find a heavy commercial deadbolt and a keypad installed by Vanguard Acquisitions. He would punch in his old code and the lock would flash red. He would punch it in again, his frustration mounting, his face flushing as Chad and Chloe watched from the driveway. He would peer through the sidelight windows, squinting through the glass, trying to see into the foyer. And that is when the absolute bone-crushing reality of the situation would hit him. He would not see his mother's imported pottery. He would not see his custom leather sofa. He would see strange generic canvas artwork hanging on walls he used to own. He would see a sterile, unfamiliar space that had forcibly rejected his existence. He would realize in a moment of sheer, breathless panic that his keys did not work. His home was gone and everything he valued in the world had been erased while he was drinking margaritas on a beach. I picked up my coffee, the dark liquid swirling gently in the mug, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vibrant, pulsing life of the city. I was entirely untethered. My son was safe. My finances were fortified behind an impenetrable wall of corporate LLCs, and my spirit was completely unbroken. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, relishing the heat, and silently counted down the hours until Marcus Williams finally realized that the woman he thought he could discard had just liquidated his entire life. While Marcus was busy dictating dinner menus and issuing arrogant commands from 1,000 miles away, the Vanguard acquisitions crew had officially breached the perimeter of Oakwood Drive. I did not need to be standing in the driveway to witness the chaos unfolding. Vanguard's project manager, a ruthless efficiency expert named Hector, was required to upload time-stamped progress photographs directly to the vendor portal to verify the property was being prepped for immediate staging. I opened the gallery on my laptop. The camera angles in the photos were tilted slightly downward, framing the scene from the perspective of a man surveying a conquered battlefield. The images captured the magnificent, brutal reality of corporate demolition. The photos showed a house that had been instantly and violently stripped of its soul. The heavy mahogany front door was propped wide open with a concrete block, letting the humid Georgia air swallow the sterile, climate-controlled environment Marcus had always demanded. A thick layer of white gypsum dust already coated the imported hardwood floors. Vanguard was wasting no time. Their primary objective was to transform the chopped-up traditional floor plan into a massive open-concept space designed to maximize short-term rental capacity. To achieve that, the non-load-bearing wall separating the formal dining room from the custom kitchen had to be obliterated. I clicked to the next photograph. A worker in a high-visibility vest was swinging a 12-pound sledgehammer directly through the custom wainscoting Beatrice had practically forced me to install. The drywall was exploding in a cloud of chalky white powder, burying the remnants of their carefully curated aesthetic under heavy layers of industrial debris. But the most intensely satisfying images were the ones documenting the extraction of their personal property. Marcus's entire identity was woven into the fabric of his wardrobe. He owned dozens of custom-tailored Italian suits. Each one was meticulously pressed, sheathed in protective garment bags, and hung with exactly 2 inches of precise spacing in his massive cedar-lined closet. He wore those suits like psychological armor. They were his daily costume designed to project an aura of infinite wealth and absolute authority to anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. To Hector's demolition crew, however, those suits were simply unauthorized textiles obstructing the renovation schedule. The photos documented the aftermath of the sweep. There was no sorting. There was no delicate folding or careful boxing. The contractors had brought in massive rolls of thick 3-mil black contractor bags, the heavy-duty kind typically used to haul away broken roof tiles and wet insulation. They had marched into the master suite, grabbed the suits by the handful, and violently ripped them down from the custom racks. The sharp snap of breaking wooden hangers was the only eulogy his precious wardrobe received. The fine Italian wool, the silk linings, the monogrammed cuffs. All of it was aggressively shoved into the dark plastic maws of the garbage bags. The image showed a contractor literally stepping on the fabric with his heavy dust-covered work boots to compress the material, squeezing out the air so he could fit more of Marcus's towering ego into a single bag. Then came his watch collection. Marcus had kept a heavy glass-top display case sitting on his mahogany dresser, housing what he claimed to his friends was a highly valuable portfolio of luxury timepieces. I knew the truth. I had managed the banking. 2 of them were entry-level status symbols he had financed at 24% interest, and the rest were high-end replicas he had purchased online to maintain the illusion of staggering, untouchable wealth. Hector's crew did not bother to appraise them. A photo showed the display case shattered, the velvet presentation cushions ripped out and discarded. The heavy metal watches were scooped up like cheap arcade tokens and dumped unceremoniously into the bottom of a contractor bag, clanking against broken picture frames, empty cologne bottles, and loose pocket change. I scrolled to the next batch of images, focusing my attention on the guest wing. Chloe's temporary quarters. Chloe treated her physical appearance with the exact same obsessive devotion that Marcus treated his bank image. Her vanity table had been a chaotic, glittering landscape of exorbitantly expensive cosmetics. glass bottles of designer foundation, limited edition eyeshadow palettes, imported skin serums, and perfectly clean natural hair makeup brushes. She had spent hours sitting at that mirror, critically evaluating my appearance while applying her own mask. Vanguard's demolition crew did not respect delicate glass or expensive branding. The workers had simply taken a heavy push broom to the top of the vanity. The photos showed a beautiful, tragic mess scattered across the floor. Pallets of pressed powder were crushed underfoot, smearing bright, expensive streaks of color into the white drywall dust. The heavy glass bottles of premium serums had shattered the oily liquids, soaking into the cheap, dark plastic of the garbage bags. Everything Chloe used to feel superior, everything she used to craft her arrogant, untouchable persona, was swept up indiscriminately with the sawdust and the discarded fast food wrappers left behind by the laborers. I kept clicking through the gallery, watching the methodical, unsentimental erasure of an entire family line. The bloated, heavy bags were dragged down the grand staircase, the rough plastic leaving thick, dirty streaks across the plush white carpet that Beatrice had once demanded I vacuum twice a week. The contractors hauled them out the front door, dragged them down the pristine concrete driveway, and dumped them straight onto the curb. The final photograph in the portal gallery was a breathtaking masterpiece of modern irony. It was a wide shot taken from the street. The sprawling, elegant facade of the Oakwood Drive estate stood silently in the background, its windows dark and empty. In the foreground, sitting directly on the manicured grass of the curb, was a massive, disorganized mountain of black contractor bags. They were lumpy, heavy, and coated in a fine layer of construction dust. Inside those anonymous, ugly plastic bags was everything Marcus, Chad, and Chloe valued in the world. The tailored Italian suits, the fake replica watches, the designer cosmetics, the expensive leather shoes, the gaming peripherals, the entire physical manifestation of their so-called class and status. It was no longer luxury. It was no longer wealth. Legally and practically, it was officially classified as municipal solid waste. It sat there under the hot, unforgiving Atlanta sun, totally indistinguishable from the grass clippings and household garbage of the neighbors. The bags were just waiting for the heavy grinding gears of the city garbage truck to arrive. The hydraulic compactor would scoop them up, crush the fine Italian wool and the shattered cosmetic glass into a dense, unrecognizable cube of refuse and haul it away to a landfill long before Marcus even boarded his flight in Nassau. I closed the photo gallery, the reflection of the monitor turning my eyes into sharp, calculating points of light. Marcus had sent me a text demanding a clean house. He was getting a gutted, hollow shell. He had demanded a hot, home-cooked dinner. He was getting a banquet of absolute ruin. I reached for my coffee, taking a long, slow sip as the city moved far below me. The bitterness on my tongue felt incredibly, undeniably sweet. The afternoon sun baked the concrete of Oakwood Drive, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across the manicured lawns of the neighborhood. I wasn't there in person, but I didn't need to be. The Vanguard Acquisitions project manager, Hector, had synced a temporary live feed security camera to the construction pole out front to monitor his crew's hours and prevent material theft. I had intercepted the IP address and login credentials during the escrow transfer. I sat in my quiet penthouse, the live feed expanded across my primary monitor, watching the culmination of my life's hardest lesson broadcast in real-time high-definition video. At exactly 3:14 in the afternoon, a black luxury SUV, a premium rideshare, naturally, because Marcus would never subject himself to a standard cab, pulled up to the curb. The vehicle came to a smooth halt. For a moment, the tinted windows hid the impending disaster. Then the doors opened, and the reality of their Caribbean nightmare spilled out onto the searing Georgia asphalt. Marcus stepped out first. Even through the digital feed, his exhaustion was palpable. His linen shirt, which he undoubtedly thought made him look like a relaxed island tycoon, was wrinkled and sweat-stained. His shoulders carried a heavy, invisible weight. He had spent the last 24 hours mentally juggling a mountain of maxed-out credit cards and drafting the perfect commanding speech he planned to deliver to me the second he walked into the kitchen. Beatrice emerged next, her face pinched in a permanent scowl, aggressively fanning herself with a glossy, duty-free magazine. Chloe followed, complaining audibly. I could read her body language perfectly as she struggled to pull her oversized designer tote bag from the back seat. Finally, Chad stumbled out. His neck craned downward, eyes glued to his smartphone, entirely disconnected from the physical world around him. They moved toward the trunk, dragging out their heavy, brightly colored suitcases. They were a parade of misplaced arrogance. Marcus tipped the driver with a stiff, practiced nod, likely adding to a credit card balance he couldn't afford, and turned to face what he believed was his impenetrable fortress. He grabbed the handle of his rolling luggage and began the march up the long, sweeping driveway. He walked with an artificial swagger, projecting an aura of total control for the benefit of his mother and brother. He was the patriarch returning from exile, ready to reclaim his throne. He did not notice the faint, powdery white footprints tracking across the dark pavement. He did not notice that the immaculate flower beds Beatrice usually obsessed over were lightly dusted with pulverized drywall. He was entirely focused on the front door, anticipating the rush of cool central air conditioning and the sight of my submissive compliance. He reached the grand stone steps of the porch. Beatrice was right on his heels, muttering complaints about the humidity and demanding an iced tea the moment they got inside. Marcus dropped his suitcase handle and stepped up to the spot where his $1,000 smart lock used to be. I leaned closer to my monitor, watching the exact second his brain failed to process the visual information in front of him. The sleek, glowing digital keypad he had installed was gone. In its place was a heavy, brushed steel commercial deadbolt and a rugged industrial lockbox hanging from the doorknob. The door itself, once a pristine, polished mahogany, was covered in a fine layer of gray dust and marred by a deep, jagged scratch near the hinges where Vanguard's crew had roughly hauled a load of debris outside. Marcus stood frozen. He blinked, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to clear a hallucination. He reached out a hesitant hand, his fingers hovering over the unfamiliar metal lockbox. He tapped the heavy steel, expecting it to somehow transform back into his high-tech touchscreen. Nothing happened. The door remained firmly, solidly shut. "Marcus, what is the holdup?" Beatrice snapped from the bottom of the steps, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. "It is 95 degrees out here. Open the door." Marcus didn't answer. Panic, cold and sharp, began to bleed through his sunburned complexion. He frantically reached into his pockets, pulling out his smartphone. He opened the proprietary app for his old smart lock, stabbing his thumb against the screen. The app simply spun a little loading circle, mocking his desperation, returning an error message, "Device not found. Connection failed." "Marcus!" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill and echoing down the quiet street. "Hold on, Mom. There's an issue with the network." Marcus stammered, his voice tight. He stepped closer to the door, peering through the narrow sidelight windows. The glass was coated in a thick layer of dust from the inside, obscuring the view. He pressed his face against the pane, squinting hard. What he saw, or rather what he failed to see, sent a visible shockwave through his body. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the welcome mat. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The grand foyer table was gone. The crystal chandelier was gone. The plush runner rug was gone. There was nothing but bare, echoing space and exposed subflooring. "What are you doing?" Chloe whined, dragging her suitcase up the driveway, her heels clicking loudly. "Did she lock us out? I swear, Marcus, if she locked us out, I am going to scream. I need a shower." Chad finally looked up from his phone, sensing the disruption in their usual dynamic. "Yo, bro, just use the key. It's too hot for this." "The lock is gone," Marcus whispered, the reality finally tearing through his vocal cords. "The whole lock is different." Before Beatrice could launch into a tirade about my perceived incompetence, before Marcus could attempt to break a window, the heavy mahogany door suddenly shuddered. A loud metallic clank echoed from the inside as a deadbolt was thrown back. Marcus stepped back instinctively, his chest puffing out, ready to deliver a blistering reprimand to whoever was on the other side. He fully expected to see me cowering and apologetic, trying to explain away a bizarre misunderstanding with a locksmith. He opened his mouth, drawing in a breath to unleash his fury. The door swung wide open, hitting the interior wall with a heavy thud. It was not me. Standing in the threshold was a man who looked like he chewed gravel for breakfast. He was at least 6'4", broad-shouldered and covered in a thick layer of white construction dust that clung to his sweat-soaked t-shirt. His arms were heavily tattooed with dark, intricate sleeves that peeked out from under his work gloves. A battered yellow hard hat sat pushed back on his head, and he held a heavy iron crowbar casually in his right hand. He chewed slowly on a piece of gum, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the 4 manicured, sunburned people standing on the porch with their matching designer luggage. The silence was absolute. The cicadas in the nearby trees seemed to stop buzzing. The vanguard foreman wiped a dusty forearm across his brow, leaving a streak of grime. He looked from Marcus to Beatrice to Chloe, and finally to Chad. He did not look impressed. He did not look intimidated. He looked like a man who was getting paid by the hour and was deeply annoyed by the interruption to his demolition schedule. "Who are you looking for?" the foreman asked. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that rumbled through the humid air. It was not a polite customer service greeting. It was a blunt, territorial demand. Marcus was completely paralyzed. The arrogant patriarch, the man who commanded boardrooms and dictated the lives of his family members, had been entirely stripped of his voice. His brain was caught in a catastrophic misfire, unable to reconcile the tattooed giant holding a crowbar with the luxurious, compliant home he believed he owned. He just stared, his jaw slack, his eyes darting frantically past the foreman into the hollowed-out cavern of the foyer. Beatrice clutched the collar of her blouse, taking a frightened step backward behind her eldest son. Chloe gasped, dropping her tote bag onto the concrete. But Chad, insulated by years of unearned privilege and a total lack of real-world consequences, failed to read the danger in the room. He had spent his entire life watching his brother bully waitstaff, belittle me, and command spaces he didn't truly own. Chad thought this was just another service worker who needed to be put in his place. He thought this was a simple mistake that required a firm, aggressive hand. Chad pushed past Marcus, stepping up to the very edge of the threshold. He puffed out his narrow chest, tilting his chin upward to compensate for the significant height difference. He put on his best, most obnoxious imitation of his brother's corporate swagger. "Call your boss out here right now," Chad demanded, his voice dripping with condescending upper-middle-class entitlement. He pointed a finger aggressively at the center of the foreman's dusty chest. "I don't know what kind of scam your crew is running, but we are the owners of this house. Pack up your tools and get off our property before I call the police." The giant foreman did not flinch at Chad's threat. He simply chewed his gum, turned his head, and spat onto the ruined grass of the front lawn. I leaned closer to my monitor, the cool leather of my chair squeaking softly in the silent penthouse. I had switched my view from the Vanguard portal to a high-definition live feed I had quietly secured access to weeks ago. The neighbor directly across Oakwood Drive had a premium wide-angle driveway camera. I had paid the neighbor's tech-obsessed teenage son $500 to share the login credentials, claiming I needed to monitor for package thieves while traveling. It provided a flawless, unobstructed view of the confrontation. From my vantage point, high above the city, the screen reflected in my eyes, capturing a moment of profound, exquisite justice. A second figure emerged from the dusty cavern of the gutted foyer. This was Hector, the regional project manager. Unlike the demolition crew, Hector wore a crisp polo shirt, tailored slacks, and a hard hat that looked brand new. He carried a sleek leather clipboard. He walked with the absolute unbothered authority of a man who held the full weight of commercial property law firmly in his grasp. Hector stepped past his foreman and looked at Chad with mild clinical disgust. He did not yell. He did not match Chad's frantic, high-pitched entitlement. He simply opened his clipboard and pulled out a thick packet of legal documents. On the very top page, clearly visible even through the digital feed, was the heavy crimson embossed seal of the state of Georgia. Hector flicked the document toward Marcus, completely ignoring the posturing younger brother. "Homeowners." Hector's voice was crisp, cutting through the heavy, humid summer air like a surgical scalpel. "This property belongs to Horizon Investment Group. We purchased this parcel legally in cash from Apex Properties, LLC. The deed was recorded with the county at exactly 10 this morning. Marcus reached out with trembling, sunburned hands, taking the heavy parchment. I watched his eyes scan the page. I knew exactly what he was reading. He saw the red seal. He saw the corporate signatures. He saw the undeniable, legally binding reality of his total displacement. The blood drained from his face so rapidly, he looked as though he might physically collapse onto the hot concrete. His mouth opened, but his throat had completely seized up. The illusion of his wealth, his authority, and his patriarchal control was dissolving right in front of his family. Chloe finally found her voice, her shrill tone piercing the heavy silence. "What about our things? My clothes, my bags, my makeup is in there." Hector looked at her, his expression entirely devoid of empathy. It was the look of a man who dealt with evictions and corporate liquidations every single day. He pointed an expensive pen toward the empty, sun-baked curb. "You mean the abandoned chattel left inside a commercially liquidated asset? As per Section 4 of our acquisition agreement, anything left on the premises after the transfer of deed is classified as construction debris. My crew bagged your trash and threw it in the city dump 4 hours ago." The words hung in the air, heavy and fatal. "Your trash." Chloe let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. The designer bags she had flaunted, the expensive serums she had used to mask her insecurities. The entire carefully curated wardrobe she relied upon to project her fake status. All of it had been legally categorized as garbage and hauled to a municipal landfill. She looked at Marcus, expecting him to roar, expecting him to unleash his fury and demand restitution. But Marcus was still staring at the red seal on the document, his body frozen in a state of catastrophic shock. Beatrice erupted. The aristocratic, refined facade she had carefully maintained for decades shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but raw, feral desperation. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream. She dropped her glossy, duty-free magazine onto the driveway and charged up the stone steps. Her manicured hands were raised like claws, her face contorted in absolute rage. She was determined to force her way past the giant foreman, determined to push her way into the hollow shell of the house, to rescue her hideous Tuscan pottery and her perceived social standing. The foreman did not strike her. He simply stepped squarely into the center of the doorway, his heavy, steel-toed boots planting firmly on the floorboards, and crossed his massive, dusty arms. Beatrice crashed directly into him, her fists beat against his chest, her voice cracking as she screamed about her priceless antiques and her rights. She might as well have been punching a solid brick wall. The foreman did not budge a single inch. A second contractor stepped out from the shadows of the gutted dining room. He placed a firm, heavy hand on Beatrice's shoulder and pushed her roughly backward. The force of the shove sent her stumbling clumsily down the stone steps, her expensive sandals catching on the concrete. Chad barely managed to drop his phone and catch her before she hit the asphalt. Beatrice clung to her youngest son, hyperventilating, her perfectly styled hair falling in wild strands across her face, completely stripped of her dignity. Hector did not even blink at the physical altercation. He pulled a heavy two-way radio from his belt, his eyes fixed coldly on Marcus. "If you are not off this property in 60 seconds, Hector warned, his voice echoing with absolute finality, "I am dispatching the local precinct to arrest all 4 of you for criminal trespassing on an active commercial job site." Marcus finally looked up from the document. His eyes were wide, glassy, and completely hollow. He looked at the giant foreman blocking the door. He looked at Hector holding the radio. He looked at his mother sobbing hysterically in Chad's arms, and he looked at Chloe, who was staring at him with a mixture of terror and dawning disgust. He was a king without a kingdom, a dictator without subjects, a man who had just discovered that the ground he had been standing on for years had never actually belonged to him. He swallowed hard, the sound visible even through the camera feed. He did not argue. He did not threaten to call his lawyers. He simply reached down, grabbed the handle of his heavy suitcase, and turned his back on the house. I sat back in my chair in the penthouse, the bitter taste of the coffee lingering on my tongue. The satisfaction flooding my veins was absolute and intoxicating. They had arrived expecting a feast of submission. Instead, They had been served a banquet of total irreversible ruin. Marcus had turned his back, his hand gripping the plastic handle of his heavy suitcase, fully prepared to retreat from the overwhelming reality of the brushed steel deadbolt. But the toxic, fragile male ego is a highly volatile compound. As he took that first step away from the porch, Chad's obnoxious booming voice echoed across the driveway, demanding the foreman's boss. It was the catalyst Marcus needed to snap out of his catatonic shock. He could not walk away. He could not look weak in front of his younger brother, and he certainly could not let his mother see him surrender his perceived kingdom to a man in a dusty yellow hard hat. Marcus dropped the handle of his suitcase. The heavy luggage hit the concrete with a loud smack. He spun back around, his face flushing a deep, furious crimson, and thrust his hand into his pocket. He pulled out his smartphone, his fingers trembling with a lethal mixture of adrenaline and humiliation. He was going to use the ultimate weapon of the entitled suburbanite. He was going to call the police. I leaned closer to my monitor, taking a slow sip of my tea. Through the high-definition lens of the neighbor's driveway camera, the frantic, erratic energy of the scene was palpable. It played out like a tightly framed handheld documentary of a collapsing dynasty. Marcus pressed the phone to his ear, his chest heaving as he paced a tight, agitated circle at the bottom of the porch steps. He adopted his most authoritative, commanding voice, the one he reserved for intimidating junior brokers at his firm. He loudly informed the 911 dispatcher that a group of aggressive, unauthorized contractors had broken into his primary residence, destroyed his property, and were currently threatening his family. He demanded an immediate dispatch. He demanded armed officers. Hector, the Vanguard project manager, did not even flinch. He simply leaned against the stone pillar of the porch, crossed his ankles, and casually checked an email on his tablet. The absolute indifference of the corporate machine was maddening to Marcus. Inside the house, the demolition crew fired up a heavy-duty reciprocating saw. The violent mechanical screech of metal tearing through drywall and wood studs echoed out onto the driveway. Beatrice covered her ears, her face contorting in agony as the sounds of her beloved stolen sanctuary being ripped apart assaulted her senses. It took exactly 12 minutes for the local authorities to arrive. Two heavy Ford Explorer police cruisers turned sharply onto Oakwood Drive, their light bars flashing a brilliant strobing blue and red against the manicured trees, though their sirens were mercifully silent. The heavy doors slammed shut, and two uniformed officers stepped out onto the asphalt. The lead officer was a tall, broad-shouldered veteran with silver hair at his temples and a completely unamused expression. He adjusted his heavy utility belt and walked methodically up the driveway. Marcus practically sprinted to meet them. He began talking wildly before the officers even had a chance to speak, gesturing frantically toward Hector and the dusty foreman standing on the porch. "Officers, thank God!" Marcus practically shouted, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. "These men have illegally breached my home. They drilled through my smart lock, they threw our personal belongings into the street, and they are actively destroying the interior. I want them removed immediately, and I want the foreman arrested for trespassing and destruction of private property." The veteran officer held up a single black-gloved hand, instantly silencing Marcus's frantic tirade. He looked past the sweating, sunburned man in the wrinkled resort wear and locked eyes with Hector. Hector stepped forward calmly. He did not raise his voice. He did not point fingers. He simply held out his sleek leather clipboard, flipping it open to the thick packet of documents. "Good afternoon, officers," Hector said smoothly, his tone the epitome of corporate cooperation. "I am the regional project manager for Vanguard Acquisitions. We are the authorized contractors for Horizon Investment Group. We took legal physical possession of this commercial asset at exactly 10 o'clock this morning. Here is the verified bill of sale, the transfer of deed, and our corporate work orders." The lead officer took the clipboard. He examined the top page, his eyes lingering on the heavy embossed crimson seal of the state of Georgia. He flipped to the second page, then the third. His expression remained entirely neutral. "I need to verify these records in the county database." The officer said, his voice flat. He did not hand the clipboard back to Hector. Instead, he turned and walked back down the driveway toward his cruiser, leaving Marcus standing in a suffocating cloud of his own manufactured anxiety. The wait was agonizing. Through the camera feed, I watched Marcus grind his teeth, his jaw muscles jumping erratically. He was sweating profusely now, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at Beatrice, offering her a tight, forced smile of reassurance, but his eyes were wide with a mounting primal terror. He still believed deep down in his deluded core that he could talk his way out of this. He believed the house was legally tied to me, and therefore by the corrupted rules of his marriage it belonged to him. 5 agonizing minutes passed. The rhythmic, destructive thud of sledgehammers continued to echo from inside the house, mocking the silence on the driveway. Finally, the cruiser door opened. The lead officer stepped out carrying the clipboard. He walked back up the driveway, his heavy boots crunching against loose pebbles of drywall debris. He bypassed Marcus entirely and handed the clipboard directly back to Hector. Then the officer turned to face Marcus. The look in the policeman's eyes was no longer neutral. It was stern, authoritative, and completely lacking in sympathy. "Sir," the officer said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet suburban street. "I just ran a comprehensive check on the county tax database, the digital deed registry, and the municipal utility records." "Then you know this is a mistake," Marcus interrupted desperately. "My wife's holding company owns this property, Apex Properties, LLC. Apex Properties, LLC, sold this parcel." The officer corrected his tone, dropping an octave, carrying the heavy weight of absolute legal certainty. "The deed was legally transferred to Horizon Investment Group this morning, but more importantly, Mr. Williams, your name does not exist on a single piece of paper associated with this address. You are not on the title. You are not on the mortgage. You are not on the municipal tax roll." Marcus staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. "But I live here. I pay the utility bills." "You were a month-to-month tenant," the officer stated coldly, delivering the final fatal blow to Marcus's ego. "And according to the sworn affidavit from the previous legal owner, you abandoned the property last week. The new owners have taken lawful possession. You have absolutely no legal standing here. I am officially ordering you and your family to vacate this private property immediately." The words shattered the air. Month-to-month tenant, abandoned, vacate immediately. Marcus was completely destroyed. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pallid gray. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords were paralyzed. The ultimate patriarch had been legally reduced to a transient squatter in front of his mother, his brother, and his sister-in-law. But Chad, incapable of reading a room and severely poisoned by internet forums and unearned arrogance, decided it was his time to shine. Chad stormed up the driveway, pushing past Marcus. He pointed his smartphone directly at the police officer, tapping the screen aggressively. "Hold on a second, officer," Chad barked, utilizing a tone of supreme, unearned superiority. "I know the law. You cannot just kick us out. This is a blatant violation of the Georgia Landlord-Tenant Act. We have established residency here. We require a formal 30-day written eviction notice served by a judge. This constitutes an illegal detainer and a constructive eviction. We demand immediate access to the premises." The veteran officer did not argue. He did not debate legal statutes with a man wearing a designer tracksuit. The officer simply stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Chad in a single fluid motion. He unclasped the heavy leather pouch on his utility belt, resting his hand deliberately on his steel handcuffs. "Listen to me very carefully, son." The officer growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous low decibel that cut straight through Chad's bravado. "You are currently trespassing on an active commercial job site. You have been given a lawful order to disperse. If you raise your voice at me again, or if you take one more step toward that door, I will drop you to the pavement. I will put you in cuffs, and I will personally book you into county lockup for criminal trespass and obstruction of justice. Do we understand each other?" The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. Chad's arrogant, puffed-up chest collapsed inward. The smartphone dropped to his side. The aggressive pseudo-legal posturing evaporated into thin air, entirely extinguished by the cold, hard threat of actual consequences. He physically shrank, backing away with his hands raised in a gesture of total, terrified submission. The electricity was completely cut to his ego. He had nothing left to say. Watching her husband cower and retreat, Chloe completely lost her grip on reality. The realization that her luxury vacation had ended in a literal garbage dump on the side of the road finally broke through her shallow, materialistic brain. She fell to her knees, right there on the hot asphalt of the driveway. She looked over at the massive, dusty pile of black contractor bags sitting on the curb, knowing her expensive serums, her designer bags, and her entire curated identity were crushed inside them. She threw her head back and let out a raw, hysterical wail. She began to sob uncontrollably, her hands clawing at her own hair, completely oblivious to the police officers, the construction workers, and the neighbors who were undoubtedly watching from their windows. She cried for her ruined makeup, her lost status, and the terrifying realization that she was bound to a man who had just cowered away from a simple threat. I watched the screen, my heart beating in a slow, calm rhythm. The police officers stood firm, their arms crossed, waiting for the family to collect their remaining luggage and retreat to the street. Marcus was broken. Chad was silenced. Chloe was hysterical. Beatrice was shivering in the heat, clutching her purse like a life preserver on a sinking ship. I took another sip of my tea. The digital feed was crisp, the audio was clear, and the absolute destruction of the Williams family was finally beautifully complete. My phone vibrated against the polished surface of my desk, shattering the quiet of the penthouse. The caller ID flashed Marcus's name. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the digital panic before finally tapping the speaker icon. The audio that flooded my office was pathetic. Marcus was practically hyperventilating the ambient noise of passing traffic and Chloe's continued sobbing echoing in the background. He was standing on a public sidewalk with 4 suitcases entirely stripped of his power. "Nia, what did you do?" His voice cracked a high and desperate sound. "The police just kicked us out. They said Apex Properties sold the house. They said I was just a tenant. You have to call them and fix this right now." I leaned back in my leather chair, letting my eyes sweep across the vast floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The city skyline sparkled beneath me, a glittering testament to my quiet patience. "I cannot fix a legal transaction, Marcus," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "But I can clarify a few things for you. Do you remember the $3,500 you transferred to Apex Properties every single month for the last 4 years?" "The mortgage," he gasped. "I paid the mortgage, you paid rent," I corrected him smoothly. "Apex Properties, LLC is my holding company. I bought that house before we ever got married, and I put it in the LLC to protect it from your staggering financial incompetence. You have been paying my corporate account for 4 years. Thank you, by the way. Your generous monthly contributions provided the exact capital I needed to purchase the penthouse I am currently sitting in. Enjoy the streets." I ended the call and permanently blocked his number before he could utter another syllable. The fallout over the next few months was as swift as it was brutal. Marcus had financed their entire luxury Caribbean vacation on high-interest credit cards, fully expecting to leverage the equity in what he thought was his house to pay off the $40,000 balance. Without the house, his financial house of cards collapsed. His credit score tanked, and when his firm discovered his catastrophic insolvency, they immediately revoked his financial broker license. He went from a corporate dictator to a bankrupt liability overnight. Chad Ever, the calculating opportunist, took one look at his brother's ruin and realized the family gravy train had permanently derailed. Finding that Chloe no longer offered him access to luxury or status, he filed for divorce within the week and threw her out of his life with zero remorse. As for Beatrice, the woman who had spent years looking down on everyone from her perceived pedestal of high society reality, delivered the harshest blow of all. Without Marcus's income to subsidize her lifestyle, she was forced to take a night shift cashier position at a local grocery store just to afford the rent on a cramped 1-bedroom apartment. At 60 years old, she was finally learning the value of hard work the hard way. I filed the divorce papers the very next morning, my legal team ensuring that 100% of my legally acquired assets remained entirely untouchable. I stood up and walked toward the expansive windows of my penthouse, looking out over the sprawling city as the evening sky faded into a deep, endless black. The room felt vast, quiet, and completely mine. You cannot lock out a woman who holds the keys to your entire life. Good night.